Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about Chilling. I'm a narrator over on Chilling, kind of like similar to what I do here, but Chilling is an awesome app for horror fans featuring over 1,000 horror stories, over a dozen narrators, and some of whom you might know of from YouTube, like me, or my good friend AudionicMusic, as well as full-length novels, exclusive series, and Chilling originals. You can select and change the ambient sound in the background of the stories whenever you want to without affecting the story that you're listening to. And we release hours of new stories every week. If you click the link in the description down below, hit download, start your free trial, then you can go see if you like it for yourself. Also, Chilling is constantly doing fantastic giveaways. So if you head over to thechillingapp.com and frequently check things out, you might be able to leave a review and sign up for an awesome giveaway. So once again, scroll on down, click the link in the description, check out Chilling, let me know if you love it. And now, on to tonight's story. Case File 02173. The following has been transcribed from audio journal entries found in the AHIDive, a commercial fishing vessel recorded by the ship's captain Murray Reynolds. The AHIDive set sail for a fishing run on May 1st, 2017. The following records were made between May 2nd and June 13th. Inconsequential entries have been removed. The recordings are as follows. Entry 1. The recording device turns on to the sound of shuffling as it's being moved around. After a few seconds, the shuffling noise stops, and a voice can be heard. Is they on? Hello? Ah, I see the light. Because that means it's working. This is Captain Murray Reynolds of the AHIDive, my first journal entry on what will be my final fishing run before I retire. Kids got me this document what they're calling a historic trip. It's funny. I'm not sure I'd agree with them on that statement. I've been out on these seas for almost 50 years. Knowing this will be the last time fills me with despair. All I've ever known in this life, I don't think I've been very good at life on land. My late wife Emily had lost her battle with cancer just a few months ago. My son said he wanted me to move closer to him. Said it's to help with the grandkids, but I know he worries about me. Both my children know that I can't take care of myself, not on land anyway. Emily always took care of me, the kids, our home. Sure, I'd work around the house, but she was my rock, I'm sure she sometimes feels like a live-in nanny. She never complained. I know that I married you and the sea, Emily would always tell me with her gentle voice. She was so understanding. She was a good woman. Maybe better than I deserved. I'd give anything to be with her right now. Miss her. Miss her so much. I always wanted to retire so I could spend more time with her, but I never had the heart to leave this behind. Now, it's too late. And my God, this has gotten sappy. Didn't mean for that to happen. Old man tends to ramble on a little too much. I guess my age made me soft. Got a good crew of 3 men with me. And he's been with me a couple times before. A good kid. He's a hard worker. Michael, who stepped onto my boat for the first time just yesterday, comes very highly recommended. Think he'll work out. He seems to have a good head on his shoulders. Strong as an ox. And of course, that salty bastard I call my friend Steve. Lost count of the number of runs we've done together. He's not very far behind me in age, but he's still as quick as ever. Told him this would be my last run. Left another boat to be here, said he wouldn't miss this run for anything. He's a good man, and I'm proud to call him my friend. I'll keep this thing updated when I can. The weather's beautiful. Should have a fruitful couple of weeks. Weather's supposed to hold until the end of the month. It'll be long back then. I better go see what the crew's up to. Make sure they're ready for our first spot. I'll check back in tomorrow. How do I turn this thing. The recording ends. Entry 2. The recording device turns on. Is Murray Reynolds, captain of the Ahab 2. Yes, I don't need to say that every time, right? I'm used to hailing other ships, now recording my ramblings too for a journal. Been a good couple of days, even our few hauls, wouldn't you know it. I was right to say it'd be a fruitful trip. Fish just spilling out of our nets, so we pulled him in. Even Steve couldn't help but crack a smile. Our work's done for the day. The boys have a game of cards below, asked me to join, but I promised my kids I'd record every day, so that's what I intend to do. You know what's funny? I've only ever felt at home on the water, but now that Emily's gone, I can't help but feel a little uneasy out here. Steve says it's because I always knew she'd be at home waiting for me. I'm going home to an empty house. See, Emily was kind of like my lighthouse. I've been through my fair share of rough seas, hard times, but knowing I'd see her beautiful face again, it made it so easy. I miss her. Steve calls me lucky to have ever had someone like her in the first place. It's only natural my heart is aching the way it is. Shows how strong my love is. Specifically my love for her. Pain I feel for missing her always on the outskirts of my mind. When I'm throwing a net out or setting out of the crew playing cards, the hole I feel in my heart, it's always there. Sorry to whoever's listening to this. I just realized you probably don't want to hear a sad old captain talk about how much he misses his dead wife. Just something that's on my mind. I want to get it out. I promise every entry won't be like this. This is Captain Reynolds, signing off. The recording ends. Entry 3. The recording device turns on. The wind is faintly heard in the background. This is Captain Murray Reynolds of the... You know who I am now. At least I hope. Did a bit of a rough day today with the sea, nothing we couldn't handle. It caught me by surprise. There wasn't any nasty weather in the forecast for at least another few weeks. Skies suddenly turned gray, the wind picked up, the sea got choppy. Luckily, I got an experienced crew, so they were ready for anything. Still, as I look up into those now ominous-looking clouds, I can't shake this strange feeling. Steve and I, we both feel a change in the air, a different taste in our tongues. It's hard to explain, but when you've been at this as long as we have, it's almost like a sixth sense. You know when something terrible is about to happen. I radioed in just to be safe, but I have faith we'll be fine even if we get caught in a storm. I've seen this ship through more than a few storms in my day. The old girl may not be much to look at. She'll hold up against anything Mother Nature can throw at her. A voice is heard in the background calling for Murray. Alright, I'll cut this one short. Try and come in tomorrow, but if we do run into a storm, it may be tricky. It's Captain Reynolds signing off. The recording ends. Entry 4. The recording device turns on. Strong winds and heavy rain can be heard hitting the window. This is Captain Reynolds of the Ahab 2. I'm sure you can hear my crew and I have entered a nasty little storm. Yesterday, when I checked in, the clouds looked a little ominous. The storm is unlike anything I've ever seen. The wind and the rain have been relentless, hitting our skin like thousands of tiny knives. Haven't made much progress. Felt like it's best to stay put and wait for the storm out. At least wait it out as long as we can. The clouds are so dark. It's as if someone threw a black blanket over the entire ship. Without our lights, we can barely see. Don't understand how this harsh storm wasn't in the forecast, but these things happen. Tried to radio the Coast Guard for some information, but couldn't get a clear signal. Guess I'm not surprised by that, considering all this rain. Mother Nature's anything but cooperative. We'll be alright. A storm with this intensity can't last more than a day or two. A loud crash of thunder is heard in the background. At least I don't think it will. There's a story my first captain used to tell me about a great storm that carried evil within it. The ship would be stranded in a storm, the crew would be pulled into the unfathomable deep. Their afterlife on Fiddler's Green ripped away from them. They were forced to live out their eternity trapped in the dark waters by a horrific creature that would give no quarter. I always liked that one, even if it did give me the willies when I was a young lad. Looking out over the sea as it's being pummeled by this storm, I can't help but think of that story. It sounds like nautical nonsense, as Emily would put it. There's always a lesson in old tales like that. The lesson I took from that story was to never underestimate a storm. There's enough danger within one without some horrible monster. No matter how long the storm lasts, the crew and I, we have enough food to last us weeks. It wouldn't allow us to be anchored that long, but we'll see how things look tomorrow morning, if we have to. We'll head back to shore. I'm not going to risk the lives of my crew for one final paycheck. I'm off to join the crew below deck, maybe try some of that chili that Andy made. Haven't had a decent chili since Emily passed. This is Captain Reynolds signing off. The recording ends. Entry 5. The recording device turns on. Strong wind and heavy rain hitting window can be heard in the background, much louder than before, along with occasional thunder strikes that appear relatively close. This is Captain Murray Reynolds of the Ahab 2. We're stranded at sea. Last night something happened I can't explain. About midnight, something hit us on the port side. It was loud, like a cannon. It woke all four of us from our slumbers. We heard the noise again as we dressed, this time at the ship's stern. I ran out without any rain gear to see what happened. I can't explain it. It looked like an ungodly hand grabbed onto the stern of the ship. I swear I could make out wrinkled fingers, black nails, a skin that was pale as death. I rubbed my eyes to adjust to the low light, thinking that I was just seeing things, but I know what I saw was real. I watched in horror as the hand slowly pulled down on our ship, as if it was trying to pull us into the water. For just a second, the stern of the boat was about to enter the water. I began to slide towards the stern of the ship, and whatever in God's name was pulling us into the water, I screamed for my crew to step back. I'm not sure they could have heard me. I grabbed onto the closest line that I could find to stop myself from sliding. I looped on, and in the water, I saw it. The evil the storm brought with it was something from an old tale I now believe no living man has ever seen, or if they have, they never lived to tell about it. I saw the outline of what looked to be even more large hands in the water. It was a face. It was so clear for just a second. I felt its eyes on me. Its godless and sharp red eyes, and then I heard a loud snap. As the ship was released, I fell over. I watched the hand slowly move out of sight, and against my better judgment, I quickly ran over to the ship's stern, but it was gone. My crew ran out to check on me, see what had happened. None of them saw what I saw. And they're saying I must have been half asleep. Even Steve laughed about it. Reading too many old tales, my friend, he said, as he patted me on the back. It wasn't until this morning that we realized what had happened. This thing pulled our propeller clean off along with most of the engine. We have no means to repair what's missing. There's still no signal from the radio. I pleaded with the crew to believe me about what I saw. Even a few hours later, they still think I'm crazy. But I saw the hand, the face. It could have been the evil from the tale my old captain used to tell. The unfathomable deep. No, I need to get rest. The stress of the storm must be getting to me. We'll wait this storm out and radio for assistance. It'll be alright. I need to get a hold of myself. This is Captain Murray Reynolds signing off. The recording ends. Entry 6. The recording device turns on. Strong wind and sleet can be heard hitting a window in the background. Several thunder strikes can also be heard. Several deep breaths and sighs are recorded before any speaking begins. This is Captain Murray Reynolds of the Ahab 2. During my years on the sea, I've experienced fear on many different levels. However, the level of terror I'm feeling is unlike anything I've ever felt before. I have a hard time finding any words to even make an entry, but I think now, more than ever, I must keep these journals just in case we... Can't even think of that. We'll be all right. I gave the crew my word that I'd keep them safe and guide them through this. Even though I'm not too sure what this is, I know it's not a regular storm. I can feel that in the air. What I saw last night, I can't shake. Every time I try to close my eyes, I see those large, pale hands. Steve came to see me this morning to ask about it. I was honest with him. Never lied to him before. I wasn't about to start now. I told Steve about the hands that grabbed our ship, about the hundreds of hands I saw in the water. I told him about the face that was looking back at me. I spared no detail and looked him in the eye as every word left my lips. I've known that old bugger for a long time, but I've never seen his face change with emotion so quickly. There was concern in his eyes, deep and burning. He asked me if I was all right, that my mind might be going, or perhaps I hit my head when I fell. I laughed it off. I told him he might be right. The concerned look never left his face, but I got him talking about something else. I didn't want to worry him anymore. I asked Steve how Andy and Michael were doing when I wasn't around. Surprisingly, he said they were in good spirits. Lads had a lot of faith in me to steer us through the storm. I asked Steve to keep a close eye on them and let me know if their morale changes. I'll do everything in my power to get these boys home and safe. If what I saw last night was the unfathomable deep of legend, I can't let it take them. Not my crew. I'll do whatever's necessary. I'll protect them. It's my duty as their captain. This is Captain Reynolds signing off. The recording ends. Entry 7. The recording device turns on. Strong wind and sleet can be heard in the background. There was no other sound except for the raging storm for approximately 3 minutes. Doesn't matter. It's been a few days since my last entry. I wasn't entirely sure if I'd ever turn this thing on again, because there doesn't seem to be much point. I pride myself in being an optimistic but a realistic man. The reality is this: my crew and I, trapped on this biblical storm with no way of escaping. We can't call for a rescue. Not that anyone would be able to reach us in the storm anyway. We don't have enough food to last us a few more days. There's enough fuel for our emergency generator to last maybe an extra day or two afterwards. Once that runs out, we'll have no stove, refrigeration, lights, and nothing else to eat. This is our reality. This is what my crew understands. However, there's much more to it than that. Even if my crew does not want to listen to me, I've seen it again. A hand of the unfathomable deep. I woke up last night after falling asleep in my chair, trying to get a signal on our radio. As I made my way down to the bunks, I saw it. An ungodly large and waterlogged hand crept towards the door to the bunks. It moved slowly, almost as if it couldn't see what it was doing. The hand was attached to nothing. It was just suspended in the air, almost as if it was floating. There was dirt and grime under its black fingernails. It smelled of sweet rot and salt water. Time stood still as I watched. It was almost at the door when I realized what was happening. I quickly jumped into action, drawing my knife as I ran at whatever the hell that thing was. At least it would not take my crew without going through me first. Jamming the knife into the side of the hand, I heard a horrific cry come from the water. I quickly pulled it out and before jamming it in again, dark blood oozed from the first puncture wound as I pulled my blade from the creature. It retreated into the water with more grotesque sounds emanating from the depths. I dare not approach the stern of my ship for fear of being dragged in. And instead, I stood guard at the entrance of the bunks until morning. Andy was the first of my crew to emerge from the bunks. He had a look of concern and confusion on his face when he saw me. I was soaked, dark bags under my eyes, and I still grasped my knife in my hand. I told him what had happened, and the concern on his face grew with each word I spoke. He helped me inside to warm up with the promise of keeping watch himself. He's a good lad. But I know he doesn't believe me. None of them do. Michael forced me to check temperature, thinking I might have come down with some kind of illness. I assured him I was in good health. But he wasn't so sure. Both Steve and Michael convinced me to stay in my bunk for the day to rest. Steve took charge of the radio for the day, but had no luck. The clock tells me it's 8:13. We have no real way of knowing if it's truly day or night. There's a darkness here that never lifts. A part of me had hoped that the storm might subside when I woke, or that Steve would have luck with the radio. I must remain realistic. Any other thoughts at this point are a farce. I'll keep watch over our ship tonight. My crew has asked me to join them below, but they did not see what I saw. They did not hear the cries coming from the depths or see the dark blood oozing from the creature I fought off that was looking to take them into the unfathomable deep. It will not take them. I won't allow it. I will keep them safe no matter the cost. A captain must do whatever he can to assure the safety of his crew. I'll sharpen my knife, and I'm ready as I can be to fight this evil for the sake of my crew. They will not know the dark waters. I will not allow it to take them. This is Captain Reynolds signing off. The recording ends. Entry 8. The recording device turns on. As with previous entries, a severe storm can be heard raging in the background. The sounds of footsteps are heard, along with Captain Reynolds talking incoherently under his breath for several minutes before he speaks clearly. I haven't rested in days. My watch has yet to end. For the last few nights, the hands have come for my crew. I'm able to fight them off, but they are many. Last night I counted 42 in total, easily scared off with my knife, but I feel my body beginning to weaken. Surely they'll overwhelm me tonight. I locked my crew in the bunkhouse 2 days ago. They begged and pleaded with me to open the door for hours, but I will not. I must keep them safe. It's my duty as their captain. At night, while they rest, I fight for their souls. They claim to not hear any of this fighting, but they claim that I've gone mad. How can they not see? How can they not understand? I had to lock them in for their protection. Although I must be realistic, tonight I fear it may be my final stand against the unfathomable deep. The clock tells me it's 1. The hands will come soon. My body will fail me, and the hands will drag my crew into the dark waters for all eternity. I will fall tonight. I'm sure of that. What else could I do? I can't risk them helping me fight. One false move and they'll be taken. I can't allow their souls to be dragged into the dark waters. If only there was some way I could free them from the darkness we found ourselves in. Some way for me to assume their souls will be spared from the hell that awaits us in the unfathomable deep. Wait. That's it. Yes. That's it. It's the only way to save them. I know what needs to be done, but I must act quickly. Before the hands come, I must assure that my crew's souls are spared from the dark waters. This is the only way I'll save them. My duty as captain is to do so. I'll save my crew from the unfathomable deep. The recording ends. Entry 9. The recording device turns on. The sound of rain gently hitting a window and light winds blowing can be heard in the background throughout this recording. I did it. I was able to stop the hands from pulling my crew into the dark waters of the unfathomable deep. Their souls will rest in Fiddler's Green. It was at great cost, but they would understand had they been in my position. What happened was necessary to save their souls. I know they would understand if they had laid their eyes upon the hands, if they saw the face I witnessed in the water that fateful night. My crew would not have called me crazy, and Steve wouldn't have tried to convince them to lock me in the bunkhouse before I could lock them in myself. Maybe things would have been different if they had just understood their danger. The look on that salty old bastard Steve's face when his eyes opened to see me standing over him wasn't a look of understanding or gratitude, it was of betrayal. I looked on as he tossed himself onto the floor and tried to crawl over to the other bunks as blood poured from the wound on his throat. Steve gripped his throat and was able to stop the bleeding just enough to find Andy and Michael in their bunks. Blood pooled on the floor beneath him. Neither of those boys even opened their eyes when I dragged my knife across their throats as they slept. In their final moments, they opened their eyes for a second, but there was no life behind them. Maybe they just accepted it. But perhaps they understood more than I thought. None of that mattered now. I had saved them from being dragged into the unfathomable deep. Steve let out a sound not unlike an injured whale when he turned to me. Falling on his back, I had known Steve for a long time. I considered him one of my closest friends, so I helped him outside and I sat with him while he took in his final breath. Steve never took his eyes off me the entire time. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he choked on his blood. Felt like it took hours for him to finally take his last breath. He was always a tough son of a bitch. However, he looked away and he stared at the sea as his final breath was expelled from his lungs. I laid my friend back down in his bunk and I closed his eyes. They looked at peace with no fear of being dragged under. They now knew the peace and serenity of Fiddler's Green. As morning came, the storm lessened with severity. No doubt a reward for saving my crew from the dreaded evil below. Now I needed to rest. My work wasn't done, but I don't have the strength to do anything else today. The recording ends. It should be noted that there are several recordings of Captain Murray Reynolds talking to himself, repeating the phrase, "I saved them," over and over again. This continued for approximately 7 days, as seen on the recording device's files. With each new recording, the storm lessens until no audible storm is heard in the background of the logs. Entry 9. The recording device turns on. Gentle waves are heard in the background. After several minutes of a muffled voice speaking, Captain Murray Reynolds is heard screaming for approximately 10 minutes. There are no discernible words aside from, "I saved them," which he repeats. Entry 10. The recording device turns on. For several minutes, footsteps are heard, rapidly approaching, and then moving away from the recording device. This continues until static is heard from an unknown source. Hello? Is anyone there? Captain Reynolds, do you copy? Attention, crew of the Ahab 2, do you copy? The above message repeats 5 times before Captain Reynolds can be heard in the distance. They've reached us. They're too late. I spared my crew from the dark waters. I must tell them. Others must be warned that the legends are true. Rapid footsteps are heard approaching the recording device. The click of a button is heard before Captain Reynolds speaks again. I copy. This Captain Reynolds of the Ahab 2. We were attacked, but my crew was saved. We don't require any assistance. Captain, do you mean you do not require assistance? Your ship was attacked? How has your crew been saved? Are there any injuries? We have a Coast Guard heading your way. There are a few hours, but don't worry, we'll help you and your crew. A loud thud is heard. Do you have cotton in your ears, boy? I told you, we do not need any assistance. My crew has been saved from what was attacking us. I do not need help. Do not send anyone into these waters. Something is out there. Something very evil. Captain, what are you talking about? What attacked you? Where is your crew? My crew has been saved. Their souls released so they wouldn't be dragged into the unfathomable deep. I saved them from the dark waters and granted them the paradise of Fiddler's Green. I saved them. This is the captain's job to protect his crew, no matter the cost. There is silence for several seconds. Captain, is your crew... Are they alive? No. Their souls have been released so they wouldn't suffer the dark waters. I saved them. They would thank me if they could, had they seen what I saw. Captain Reynolds, are you confirming that you killed Steve Thomas, Andrew Rogers, and Michael Coppers? You killed them. No, boy, I freed them from an eternity of torment in the dark waters of the unfathomable deep. It had to be done by my hand. I was the only one who understood. I was the only one who saw the hands of the unfathomable deep. Of course, I wish it didn't have to come to that, but I saved them. They were free from an eternity of torment. Do not send anyone here. Spare them. The hands will take them and drag them into the unfathomable deep. There is no response on the radio. I freed them. They will thank me one day. I'll see them again, and they'll thank me. They'll thank me. The recording ends. Entry 11. The recording device turns on. A gentle wind is blowing in the background as panicked breaths can be heard. I saw it again. The face of the unfathomable deep, it's returned. Why? I saved my crew. What else could it possibly want? There are several minutes of unintelligible speech, along with panicked breathing. Unless it wants me. In sparing my crew from the dark waters, have I doomed myself? It's looking at me. Its eyes are that of 10,000 tortured souls. I could see the suffering so many. So many has been taken. Can he still take my crew? No. I can't let that happen. Not now. Not after what I had. It's fixated on me. It wants me. The sound of a chair scraping can be heard. To anyone who hears this, I plead to take my crew with you and leave these waters. Let my children know that their father died a hero, saving good men from an eternity of suffering. A human giving the ultimate sacrifice. Tell them I love them and that I'm sorry for everything. Footsteps are heard moving away from the recording device before stopping. A good captain will always protect his men. No matter what the cost, I will save them. Save them one last time. Out of the hands of the unfathomable deep. Drag me under. The footsteps are heard walking away from the recording device until they stop. A loud splash is heard, followed by a muffled yell and splashing in the water. A loud bellowing moan is heard. This sound source is unclear. There is no sound recorded for approximately 3 hours until the Coast Guard boats arrive. The recording ends. On July 13th, 2013, at approximately 9:21 a.m., the Coast Guard arrived at the location of the Ahab-2 to find the boat in a state of disarray. The main engine had been removed from the ship by unknown means, though it is theorized that it had been removed by another ship for scrap parts. There was a large amount of dead fish found on the live storage unit. Their cause of death is yet to be determined, but it can be assumed they died due to a lack of food. Several piles of fish bones were found scattered all over the ship's deck, along with human waste and dark blood of unknown origin. The captain's cabin was in a similar state, with discarded fish bones and food spread all around. The recording device used by Captain Murray Reynolds was found. Its battery was nearly depleted, but was still recording when the rescue crews arrived. The remnants of Steve Thomas, Andrew Rogers, and Michael Copper were found in the bunkhouse of the ship. All 3 bodies were carefully laid in their bunks, eyes closed, and hands folded on their chests. The cause of death of all 3 men was blood loss due to a laceration on their throats. A large amount of blood was found near the bunkhouse entrance and near the bed of Andrew Rogers and Michael Copper. Upon review of the audio journals finding the knife belonging to Captain Murray Reynolds and DNA evidence, he was officially charged with the murder of all 3 men. It has been theorized that Murray Reynolds had a psychotic break due to the loss of his wife, and his children had contacted the police for a wellness check the day before he set off for his final fishing trip. They chose not to comment on a reason, but were concerned for their father's mental well-being. When the Coast Guard arrived, there was no sign of Murray Reynolds on board with no indication of where he might be. The only evidence of what had happened to him is the final recording, due to the splashing sound heard. It is assumed that he took his own life by drowning. The search for Captain Murray Reynolds was called off 3 days after the ship was found. The Ahab-2 was towed back to land and is currently being held as evidence, with the intention of being given to the children of Murray Reynolds should they choose to keep it. Unofficially, there is no knowledge of the unfathomable deep or the creatures described by Murray Reynolds. It may never be known what happened during the horrific storm and what exactly drove Captain Murray Reynolds to take the life of his crew and his own. Whether it was indeed a force paranormal in origin that drove him to do so, or a psychotic break. The body of Captain Murray Reynolds has never been found, and the source of the loud bellow heard near the end of the final recording has yet to be identified. Grandpa and I were out on the back porch, spending our evenings as we often did, when I asked him about a weird story my parents had used to scare me as a kid. It was some kind of monster cat that would eat me if I was bad, I said, swirling my beer around thoughtfully as I tried to remember what it was called. I used to live in fear of it since Mom said it would eat me if I didn't finish my chores. It was the whooping cat? The whomping cat. The wampus cat, my grandpa said, draining his beer and launching it into the tree line like he often did. That's the one. I hadn't thought about it in years until last night. I dreamed that I was small again, wandering around your house looking for people. I never really saw him, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see this big, shadowy creature stalking me. It kind of reminded me of one of those guys in a mascot costume. Never got a good look at it, always hiding, but I remember being pretty scared as he followed me around the house. He made this kind of sound like a house cat, but loud, big, like a cat that's been startled or is about to fight. Suddenly, Grandpa loosed a cry like a scalded cat, and I heard all the animal noise around us taper off. He looked back and asked, "Sound like that?" I was speechless. Yeah, exactly like that, but how? I taught your mother how to recognize that call. Didn't want her to go through the same horrific experience I had. Experience what exactly? I asked, slightly confused. The Wampus cat. I stared at him for a moment. The night birds starting to tune up again as Grandpa leered back and stared at the night sky. We were silent for a few minutes, the crickets loud as they put on the last concert before autumn put them to ground. Before Grandpa said, I saw him once. My head was a little foggy and I murmured out, saw what? A Wampus cat. I saw him once. My skepticism started to claw its way out, but ever since the tree incident, I had been a little more open to Grandpa's stories. Yeah? Do you mind telling me about it? Grandpa seemed to think about it for a few seconds before he began. I was about 5 or 6, and Cousin Luke came to stay for a few weeks. My mother's sister was going to stay with Luke's sister and help him deliver her first baby. She asked if Luke could stay for a while. Mama said he'd stay in the room with me, even though I said I didn't mind. I wasn't very excited about the prospect of Luke staying with us. Luke was not a good kid, you see. Luke was the baby in the family. 2 elder brothers, a sister. We were all out of the house. This had led him to be a little bit of a brat. He was always a bully. I knew I'd have to keep my eyes on my things if I didn't want them to go missing. I'd also have to make sure to spend as much time in the woods as I could when I wasn't at school. Otherwise, Luke would likely make excuses to play rough with me. I wasn't a fragile child. Luke was a few years older than me and had often left bruises after we played. So, Luke came over, bag packed for a week or more, and Aunt Cara thanked us for letting him stay. Despite her difficult son, Aunt Cara was an absolute delight. I hold her against her that I have to deal with Luke for a foreseeable future. She gave me a tight hug. She thanked me for taking Luke into my room, promising me something special when she came back. I thanked her. And I was thinking that the only gift I was looking forward to was the return of my room, the return of my quiet existence. I showed Luke to our room, showed him to the cot he'd be sleeping on, turned to find him putting his bag at the foot of my bed. When I asked him what he was doing, he just grinned like a fox, wagged a finger at me. Not very Christian of you to make a guest sleep on a saggy old cot. A real guest should be offered the bed while you sleep on the cot, don't you think? I argued with him. I wanted to, but I realized it wouldn't do any good. As I tried to get comfortable on the couch that night, listening to Luke snore lustily in my bed, it was going to be a long few weeks. However, after a week of having Luke there, I was good and ready to have him gone. In that time, he had managed to sprain my wrist after pushing me out of a tree, steal my favorite rock from my collection, though he claimed it hadn't been him, and break any number of small numbers of toys I owned. To my parents, he was an angel, always minding his manners around his mother, and especially around my strict father. He always appeared to help with chores, walked with me to school. He was polite while they were around. The second their backs were turned, he cut school, shirked chores, knocked these bumpkins to their backs. It was Sunday when their neighbor knocked at the door. I was working towards mid-afternoon, sun taking on that golden tint, you see, when it getting ready to set. And when the knock came. Hard and frantic. And Dad went to go get it. He turned out to be Mrs. Douglas, our second closest neighbor. She had run nearly 6 miles to our house to help get Mr. Douglas to the hospital. He had fallen off a ladder while fixing something, broken his leg. It was pretty bad. He managed to get him into the porch, but she didn't drive him there herself since they didn't own a car. This is the 1930s, so that wasn't uncommon. My parents agreed to go help her. And Mama told us to stay here while she went to help Daddy, and telling us to tidy up while they were gone. I asked Mama if I can go with them, said that I wanted to help. I really just wanted to be not left alone with Luke. Mama smiled, ruffled my hair, thinking I was trying to avoid cleaning, told me that I had to stay here, watch the house while they were gone. Besides, you don't want the Wampus Cat to hear that you're shirking your responsibilities, right? And that sent a shiver up my spine. Much like you, I was pretty scared of the Wampus Cat. Not just because my mama talked about it, but because my grandma talked about it. And Grandma used to say that the Wampus Cat came to get little kids who disobeyed their parents, dragged them off into the woods, devoured them in the lair. He roamed the woods listening for misbehaving children, took care of them so their parents no longer had to be burdened with them. He had coal-black fur and coal-red eyes. He's tall as a man, wide as a bear, razor-sharp teeth that seemed too big for his mouth, claws like kitchen knives. You'll know him by his cry, a sound like a cat scalded by the stove and by the smell of fresh blood. Nothing will stop him from getting his prey. Nothing. And you don't want to be the focus of his ire. No. And Grandma told me to beware of something. I bewared it. So as the old truck rumbled out the front door, I set about the chores. There were dishes to wash, there were floors to sweep, there were counters to clean. There was washing to bring in as well. As I started wiping the counters, I heard Luke snort, continuing to throw the baseball he'd been playing with up into the air before catching it. Hadn't got up off the couch. He was sitting with his head near the ground and his feet in the back. Something Mama had asked him not to do. You still believe in that old cat? I looked up, confused by the question. Of course. Mama wouldn't lie about something like that. Don't you? No, I figured out a while ago that the Wampus Cat was made up. You ever seen a cat that big? It's all nonsense. No, I tried to rationalize this, the cleaning cloth still held in my hand. It couldn't be right. My mama had never lied to me. My grandma had certainly never lied to me. My mama might tease me sometimes, but she always told me it was a joke afterwards. My grandma, though, did not tell a joke about the strange things that might be found in the Appalachian. This would muddy the waters, might cause me to question something that would get me killed. As Luke played with his ball, I continued to clean and finish my chores. As I cleaned, I began to feel something watching me. It began to tickle on the back of my neck. The feeling that I wasn't quite alone. As I washed dishes, I could almost feel a presence looming just out of sight. Its hulking form, seen out of the corner of my eye, seemed to linger near the windows, its bulk sometimes blocking out the light. I felt my eyes creeping over to have a look. I remembered what my grandma had said and kept my eyes forward, away from the windows. If you ever feel something watching you, it's best to just ignore it. Some critters really don't like being seen, and seeing them could be the last thing you ever see. I finished the dishes as the sun began to sink towards the edge of the horizon. I could feel those eyes behind me. I could feel them boring me. Didn't want to look at whatever possessed those eyes. It seemed intent on me, showing no attention to my cousin in the living room. I had to finish cleaning. Mama would be mad if I didn't. I turned around, my legs wooden pegs beneath me, and felt my breath stick in my throat as I saw him. I only saw him for a second, but that was a second too long. He loomed in the window near the mudroom. his bulk making the setting sun appear muted. His fur was coal black, looking matted and tangled, as the burdock stood out against the glass. His eyes were living coals, simmer in his head as he stared at me. His claws tapped lightly against the window. Long, yellow talons sprouted from the furry hands. His teeth were too big for his mouth. They poked out haphazardly from the heaving mouth that fogged up the glass with every breath. He moved away after a few seconds, pushing his bulk out of the windowsill. It still had been long enough to etch his image into my memory. I felt the hard wood of the cabinet as it ground into my back. Sat down on my backside, my eyes glued to the window as they bulged in fear. The window was empty, but I could still see the remains of his final gasping breath. I could see his face. If I closed my eyes, those claws would haunt my dreams for many nights to come. I was shaking as I watched the window, seeing his shadow as it slid across the porch, his weight making the boards groan and the slat. "What are you doing?" I looked over at Luke standing there with a questioning look spread across his face. I pointed shakingly towards the door, my voice refusing to come out. "Oh, what? Is the great Wampus cat waiting for me?" I nodded furiously, pointing at the window. Luke moved to the window, looked out from the porch, snorted at me, said he didn't see anything out there, moved to the door to open it, and I cried out, not making any intelligible sound, not wanting him to let it in. I sounded like a dog strangling on a bit of something, unable to draw in breath. He unlocked the door, he turned the handle, pulling on the door as if in slow motion. I screamed internally as the door swung open, my throat holding it all in till I felt like I might burst. He stepped out into the porch, looking around the door, before turning back and grinning at me. "Well, either he's great at hiding or he ain't here. Almost seems like he's made up. Told you there's no Wampus cat, nothing to punish naughty kids. Your mama lied, just like mine, and there is nothing that can do anything about." A shadow fell across him. My attention had been drawn away as he spoke, but snapped back as the large black silhouette behind him, as the doorway was engulfed. Luke still stood grinning in victory, but his smile dribbled off his face as he took notice of the shadow fell across the floor. He turned his head, ever so slightly. I don't think he ever saw the Wampus cat. The creature wrapped its thick, furry arms around him, lifting him up easily into that gaping maw of razor-sharp piano keys. Luke screamed as his head slid into the toothy mouth, and he went on screaming until the Wampus cat crunched down and ended his life. He stared at me as he stood there, Luke's body hanging in his arms before he turned and took his grisly supper back into the sea of greens. He left me sitting there, shaking, shivering. I waited for my body to work again. I sat there speechless as my grandpa finished his story. The night sounds were all around us again. The birds and bugs turning up again. And Grandpa took a sip from his nearly forgotten beer. His throat had been getting rough towards the end, and the beer seemed to wet it like a dry valley in a rainstorm. He finished the beer in one long pull and launched the bottle into the woods where it shattered against a tree. "So, what happened when they got home? I mean, surely they didn't believe that a big cat came and ate your cousin." He stared into the dark, his face that of a child who's been scared into silence. He was quiet for so long that I thought he had fallen asleep. I snapped my fingers in front of his face a few times to see if he was dozing. He snapped awake after a few seconds of this, blinking and looking around as if the fear had slid away. Even so, it was several minutes before he finally spoke. Well, as is usual, my grandma came to save me. Not from the Wampus cat. He only took naughty children. She came to save me from my terror. She found me shaking like a leaf. Door still open, sun sinking low in the sky. Took me to her house, wrapped me in a quilt. Sat there for hours, my mind throbbing under the weight of all that fear. Wouldn't every day you see the focus of your fear made flesh? I spent a few days at my grandmother's house, my mind trying to make sense of it all. My mother came in a panic after finding me and Luke missing. And when Grandma told me what happened, she tried to push away to me immediately. Grandma held her back. Told her to be patient with me. He's been through a lot, Possum. Give him time and let him rest. Seeing the Wampus cat live to tell the tale, not many can say that. I sat in that shaking stupor for quite some time before I was able to get control of myself again. Aunt Cara came to see Grandma, too. I heard her crying. She cried. She wailed as I shivered beneath my blankets. She never told. I never saw her again. She seemed to have lost her taste for the Appalachians. I went home. And I learned to live with the knowledge that there were things out there that could kill me. Things that played by their own rules. It's my first taste of the strangeness in my home. And I'll never forget it. Somewhere in the woods, a cat yowled. And I shuddered to my core. I knew it was nothing but a mountain bobcat, but it was still too close to the cry my mother had always made for my taste. I got up then, taking my own bottle to the garbage as I went back inside. Grandpa asked me where I was going before I walked inside. It took me a few seconds before I could answer him. I forgot to take out the garbage earlier. Don't want some damn cat thinking I'm shirking my house duties. My grandpa's laughter followed me into the house. When we moved into our new house on Night Soil Avenue, my wife was immediately enamored with the big garden. It was already blooming with flowers when we pulled up in the moving truck. Hundreds of roses, tulips, daffodils, lilies, daisies, and hydrangeas were lining the backyard on both sides and at the very rear of the property, iridescent in every color of the rainbow. Christine was thrilled, since she always had been a gardener, but we never had much space for flowers on our balcony. Still, she'd find a way to grow a collection of tomatoes, herbs, peppers, and cucumber plants, using large buckets filled with soil. Now she had all the space in the world to work with, an entire property that she could cultivate however she chose to. She didn't realize that there would be conditions to the garden, though. Rules to follow. And my wife was never one to follow the rules. Despite the magnificent garden at our house, it was missing a few things. Peppers, cucumbers, herbs, and tomatoes were the things we'd always grown on our balcony, so Christine immediately wanted to do the same thing at the new house. It was the beginning of summer, and so it was a bit late to be planting. Luckily, she'd brought the big pots from our balcony, and she set them out in the backyard to transplant them into the soil back there. We would have to dig a new plot, but that was no problem, since the backyard was huge. I was helping her dig when I felt, rather than saw, a person staring at me. It took me a few moments to look up, but eventually I did, and noticed my neighbor was right there, just a few feet away, standing on her back lawn. She was watching me with a blank stare, her arms hanging limply at her sides. "Good morning," I said, as warmly as I could under the circumstances. "How are you?" She was creeping me out. The way she was just standing there, her hair frizzy and out of place, one upper lip pulled back in a sneer like a territorial dog. The look she was giving me was something that would make most people want to run. But we were in our own backyard. She didn't respond to my greeting or my question. You shouldn't be doing that, she said. Doing what? My wife asked, looking genuinely curious. Read the rules, she said, then turned around and walked back inside, slamming the door behind her. We both stood there for a few seconds, quietly in awe of what had just happened. The fuck was that? My wife asked finally. I don't know. She got a frickin' screw loose. Yeah. Doubtfully, my wife went back to digging. She looked back at the neighbor's house occasionally, and so did I, disturbed to see the woman standing there watching us from her back window. That night, my wife came into the living room with a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. She was unfolding it and reading it, her eyes going wide as she paced, mouthing the words out loud. What is that? I asked nervously. She continued quietly reading for another minute as I grew more and more anxious. Christine, what is it? Finally, she answered. I found it wedged under the front doormat. Must have missed it when we moved in. A list of rules for living here. Let me see, I said. She handed the list to me. There were only 4 rules on the crumpled piece of paper, and we had broken all 4. Rule 1. You may plant flowers within the designated flower beds, but do not, under any circumstances, plant any sort of fruit or vegetable. Rule 2. Do not dig outside of the designated flower beds. These are the only areas where planting is permitted. Rule 3. Watering of gardens must be done between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. only. Autumn watering is not permitted. Rule 4. No outside soil is to be used on your property. Only soil found within the planters can be used for gardening purposes. It's a joke, I said to my wife, my throat feeling dry, my mouth parched. A prank on the new neighbors. She looked at me doubtfully, and I wished I believed it myself. I tried to work up the courage over the following weeks and months to talk to the neighbors, but I always got the feeling they didn't want to speak with me. Doors slammed when I stepped outside, eyes darted the other direction when I tried to look their way. People on my street were always in a hurry when I was around, always late for a meeting or for church, bags full of groceries in their arms, too heavy and awkward to stop for a moment to chat, and I couldn't help but think they were all in a hurry to get away from me. Like I was cursed or something. A leper they didn't want to make contact with, for fear of catching some disease. It felt like both of us were being shunned, but why? Because of some ridiculous list of rules? After a while, I stopped caring, and so did Christine. It was the only way to stay sane and avoid paranoia and unease at all hours of the day. If the neighbors were going to hate us and treat us like pariahs, then so be it. We would give them what they wanted. The two of us would be the scourge of the neighborhood and their ridiculous list of rules. My wife and I made the backyard garden bloom with fruits and vegetables, well outside the parameters of the flower beds. We replaced almost all of the grass, filling in the empty spaces with soil and mulch, and things grew amazingly well. They were corn stalks as tall as people, carrots. They were 2 feet long, titanic tomatoes, plump peppers. We had colossal cucumbers, humongous herbs, and several sizable squash. But the prize of our garden was the pumpkin. We had only made room for one, which we planted to use as a jack-o'-lantern come Halloween, and it was going to be one hell of a jack-o'-lantern. The thing was enormous, warty and misshapen, and perfect for the spooky season. It was bulbous and large, nearly the size of a small electric car. I'd never seen a pumpkin so large. As the leaves began to turn yellow and orange falling from the trees, my wife and I got more and more excited for the day when we would put the pumpkin in front of our house on the porch. It would be the talk of the town. We should harvest everything in the morning, my wife said finally. After tomorrow, we're heading into a cold snap. That means the first frost of the season. It was nearly the end of October, and we'd gotten lucky pushing it as far as we had. Around this area, a cold snap can settle in overnight quickly, despite weather reports stating the contrary. And a sudden frost can spoil an otherwise bountiful harvest. Since we'd started planting late and everything was doing so well, we'd left things to grow, content to wait out the warm weather. Guess we finally get to carve that pumpkin. Yep, it's a good thing we've got the day off work tomorrow. It's going to be a busy day. The next morning, we woke up and went straight out to the backyard with cups of coffee in hand. We stood on the back deck in the dim light of dawn. The sun was just beginning to rise in the east, casting everything in a golden glow. And that was when I saw the man on the side street, dressed in a long brown robe, holding a torch in his hand. I didn't recognize him. His eyes were staring straight ahead, looking right into my backyard. I pointed him out to Christine. Hey, I don't want to freak you out, but what is that guy doing over there? She looked over and we both stared at the man, less than 100 yards away, separated from us only by our neighbor's ample backyard and a flimsy chain-link fence between our two properties. I don't know. Do you think we should call the cops? He might start a fire. Doesn't look like he's quite all there. Nodding, I set down my cup of coffee on the wooden railing of the back deck. I had a sour taste in my mouth, and my pleasant morning felt like it had already been spoiled. Yeah, call the cops. I'll stay here and keep my eye on him. She went inside, and shortly after she did, another man joined him, standing a few yards beside him. Then another took a position equidistant on the other side. A low chant began to rise up from all sides of the property, north, south, east, and west. The words were ancient sounding, like Latin or some of the language from long before that, lost to time. I couldn't help myself. Staggering down the steps of the back deck, I went around the house towards the driveway to look for myself and see what was happening. The strange sensation of hearing the chanting from all sides was disorienting. Felt like I was in a bad dream. As dark clouds began to roll in, blocking out the golden rays of the sun. A chill crept through my bones as I staggered across the grass. It sounded like 100 voices rising up into the early morning air. The mist was still rising from the dew-covered lawn, making everything look surreal and dreamlike. When I got to the driveway, I saw the neighbors were standing all around the house, dressed in identical brown robes, just like the man on the side street. They were holding torches and chanting that low, rhythmic, ancient language, standing perfectly spaced apart. Freezing in place, I stood there, suddenly terrified. Whatever was happening here, we were not safe. Whoever these people were, they were in a cult or a secret society of some kind, and we were their target. For breaking their rules, we were going to be punished. The chanting continued as Christine came outside to find me in the driveway. "Police aren't coming," she said, holding the phone in her hand like a paperweight. They said we should have followed the rules." She looked around and seemed to notice all the cult members in their brown robes at that moment. And I took her hand and gripped it tightly in mine. A sound escaped my wife, which was somewhere between a whimper and a groan. And she surveyed our neighbors standing all around. Her eyes were wide and panicked as she glanced up at me. "We didn't see the rules until it was too late," I yelled, hoping to make them a little more forgiving of us. The prospect of us being burnt alive hadn't occurred to me until that moment, and it wasn't a visual I was particularly comfortable with. "Yeah, we're sorry," my wife tried. "We were just gonna harvest everything today anyway. We'd be happy to share with you all." They all stopped chanting at that exact moment. And then they raced towards us, screaming. Their torches were held out like spears of warriors headed into battle. Their faces were full of violent rage. My wife and I backed away as the ground began to shake beneath their feet. At first, I thought the ground was shaking because of the approaching mob, but as they raced past us and pushed us out of the way, I realized it was actually an earthquake. My wife and I were sent reeling backwards, tumbling to the ground. I looked back to see the neighbors were all falling over from the sudden tremors, and a few of their torches had gone out. What caught my eye next was what was happening in the backyard. It was impossible. There it was, right in front of me. A massive shape like a boulder was rising up from the ground where we planted our potatoes and beets. It was defying gravity as it unearthed itself. It emerged from the soil. Surprisingly, it looked like a giant root vegetable, not a boulder, as I'd first thought. And dangling from it were bones and corpses in various states of decay, which formed with other huge root vegetables intertwining to look like sinewy muscle and bone. And the corpses were moving. They were groaning and flailing as if alive. A few fell to the ground and began to clamber to their feet, roaming the backyard afterward. A huge hulking spider the size of a building was emerging from the soil of our backyard. I realized The twisting, bloated forms of zombie corpses and car-sized root vegetables made up the bulk of it, along with clumps of soil that fell crumbling to the ground constantly with each movement that it made. My neighbors were rising to their feet, relighting their torches as its head emerged from the ground. Our prized pumpkin made up its visage, and the blank, rotten faces of it were more horrifying than any jack-o'-lantern that we could have carved. Its green stalk connected to the rest of the monstrosity, compelling its hulking arachnid form. "What the hell is that?" I heard my wife mutter as the two of us backed away in nervous terror. "It's the reason we have these rules in this neighborhood," the woman I recognized from next door said, her face mostly obscured by the hooded brown robe. "You must be new to Hollow's End," said another man I realized was from across the street. "Sorry, we all just thought you were being assholes." He took out a bow, and I saw that he had a quiver of arrows slung on his back, as did many of the other neighbors. They began to light the arrows from their torches as the entire form of the massive corpse root spider came into view. It towered over us, its legs as long as telephone poles. The bodies within its mangled form began to stir as the morning light hit them. "Ready your arrows," the man next to me yelled. "Light! Aim! Fire!" A dozen arrows with flaming tips were soaring through the air a second later as bowstrings twanged and released their pent-up force. The flaming arrows hit the giant spider, and its face lit up with fire, two glowing red eyes and a mouth opening up within the blank, warty skin of the pumpkin. A hideous jack-o'-lantern visage bloomed up its face that smiled at us and breathed a gout of fire in our direction, like a dragon, a rage. My wife and I dove out of the way, as did our neighbors, just as fire scorched the space where we'd been standing milliseconds before. The pumpkin-faced spider creature let out a monstrous laugh and brought one of its legs down to stomp on us. It missed my wife and I just barely, but several of the neighbors were caught up in the tangling roots and grasping, rotten hands of the zombies reaching out from them. The dead bodies had been buried beneath the soil, I realized, and perhaps we had brought them back to life by breaking the rules. I had no time to find out. The remaining neighbors released another hail of flaming arrows. They struck the giant spider on its back and face, setting it ablaze even further. It began to march down the driveway away from the house as the townfolks ran after it in pursuit. The road was soon littered with zombies falling from the thing's underbelly. They ambled off into the neighborhood, and I heard the occasional screams they came across unsuspecting people. Houses were set alight with the falling debris of the enormous flaming vegetables, which came tumbling from the spider, smoldering and acting as perfect fire-starting material. Sporadic fires could be seen burning all around and up and down the street. I wondered if the entire city would be set on fire soon, and if the zombies would take over the planet. Both those scenarios seemed highly probable, but at least we were safe for the time being. "Uh-oh," my wife said from behind me. We might not be in the clear just yet." One of my neighbors was lying on the driveway, bleeding out. He looked up to see the same thing we were seeing. The tomatoes in the backyard hadn't been part of the giant spider. They were still hanging from their vines. But they were far from normal. Giant, plump, red tomatoes began to split open, revealing mouths filled with sharp teeth. They wriggled and broke free from the greenery and began to bounce towards us. My neighbor gasped, making a panic sound low in his throat. "Tell me you didn't grow tomatoes."
Attack of the killer tomatoes! Attack of the killer tomatoes! They'll beat you, bash you, squish you, mash you, chew you up for brunch.
I keep the doors shut in my flat. This is primarily practical. Heat retention, which becomes a more pressing need in recent months due to recent geopolitical issues, but also probably has more than a little to do with me and my brother being asked many times by my father if I'd been raised in a barn, every time one was left open growing up. It reminds me of him, in earlier times, by just following the little rules. Fairly normal thing. I want to get it out of the way before we get into why this is causing a specific problem. Enter boyfriend. Similar barn chat scenario, though he grew up really rural, so frankly, I'm not entirely convinced he didn't. His behavior over the last few weeks also really convinced me that whilst I love him, If these kinds of habits are what living outside a city does to someone, then we're never moving so much as a foot out of here. Anyway, I guess that perception has been complicated somewhat. So, it's really weird. And initially, I was gearing up to delve into relationship advice because it felt red flag adjacent at best. I didn't know how the fuck to address it. Basically, we moved in together a few months ago. I basically packed up my own flat and rented it out, all above HMRC, fully aware, and moved in. We haven't been together that long. It's been a year in June, the first Reddit relationship advice sent, but we're both fully fledged adults looking for the same thing. I mean, we have good jobs, minimal debt, normal friends. Between us, we have 2 weird exes, so we're both pretty attuned to spotting warning signs. Now, I love him. We're hitting 30 soon. We moved in together at the start of October. Naturally, as I've just moved in with my partner, things are bliss. It's a routine of breakfast, banging, and foot massages. He tells me every day that he loves me, and endearingly that I am the most wonderful, weird person that he's ever met. Yeah, more on that later. Apart from the weird pranks and the sociopathic idiosyncrasies, I had noticed as of late, it was fine. So, the first time I noticed this was the start of January. But it's such a busy time around the festive period, I've maybe been too preoccupied to see. It was the first. I was hangover personified, sick with the flu, and so I was basically intending to lightly poach myself in a bath until all this blew over. The bath faces away from the door. At some point, I glanced at the door because I've resolved to try and read a book instead of absently scrolling. And for whatever reason, I just know he's behind the door. When you're close to someone, you get a real sense of them. You know, the way that they move or don't. I couldn't see him. I couldn't see a shadow, but I knew it was him. I called out to him, asking if he needed in, though, of course, unprepared to give up my bath unless his bowels were in dire shape. But there was no response. I thought, that's fucking odd. After a bit, I'm so uncomfortable that I have to get out of the bath. And the time I was getting dressed, that sense of him standing there faded away. So I get out, and he's in the kitchen making tea. Whatever the vibes for I have been lurking outside of the bathroom are, he wasn't giving them. So over the last few weeks, he's doing it more and more. Every time that we're together in the flat and in different rooms, I can feel him outside the door of the room that I'm in. More recently, I thought because I was getting used to identifying it, because I could hear him breathe and the floorboards creak as he steps towards it, but sometimes it's still just completely silent, and it seems to almost escalate in how the atmosphere changes when it happens. An aura of tension surrounds the perimeter, ebbing and radiating into the air of any room that I'm in. It's like, whenever he's behind the door, then he's like a coiled spring. Something ready to strike, but to do what to me, and to what end? The former were more infuriating because obviously I can hear him, and so he knows that I know he's there. But the latter started to get pretty unsettling pretty fast. They made my skin crawl. I could never bring myself to open the door. It felt like opening a can of worms I wasn't prepared to deal with. It reminded me of when, as amidst my brother used to tease me by standing outside my bedroom door late at night. I was just trying to get a rise out of me in the usual back and forth who can cause the most psychological damage. You know, those games that siblings inevitably grow into. I talk about my brother a lot to him, keeping the memory alive, but I never mentioned about that. When I talk about the funny things, the good things, They don't talk about the weird stuff. It seems to intertwine with the period where he started to decline. One of the last times I heard him speak was when he was remorseful for the pranks. Maybe a week prior to him going missing, apologizing, saying that he needed to stop. So whatever it is, and I thought about whatever it could be, it wasn't like a twisted from the behind prank. This was the same but different. It was a different context. It wasn't dumb kids trying to freak each other out. It was like at that point I realized I'm living with a man that I've known less than a year, and he was standing threateningly behind doors, and I don't know what he'll do to me if I open them. But then I'd spend time with him, and he was like the normal dude that I met. And those times outnumbered the doors. It had only been a few weeks, so on the one hand, I was with this great guy, and then on the other hand, I was with some sort of maniacal reincarnation of a children's game that I'd rather forget about. It came to a head recently. I was in the shower, and even with shampoo in my eyes, I just felt it. I felt him standing there through the door, breathing softly against the wood, and I was just so fucking sick of it, and I'm fairly certain I could take him in a fight because he's a fucking accountant doing couch to 5K. So I got out. And in the most intimidating way, a naked person with No More Tears strawberry shampoo on can be, I opened the door. What met me was the same look on my boyfriend's face that he got the time he won an argument about the best place to keep all the socks. He looked really fucking benignly pleased with himself. And he said, within the same heartbeat, "See? It's fucking weird, isn't it?" So at that point, the big scary unknown is just standing there in his pajamas, holding a beer and his phone open to a news article about the downfall of Sunderland Football Club. Obviously, the standing was being boring at some stage, looking like he just won the world's dumbest argument. As I'm realizing this, he's in tandem seeing a very scared, very angry version of his girlfriend about to jump over the threshold and strangle him. There is, at that point, a pause that feels like it could stretch into eternity. I ask him, eventually, to kindly explain what the fuck he's talking about. He looked more cautious then, doubtful. Then he gathered himself and said that he could ask me the same thing, and that it's been driving him up the wall. Now, cue me crying and hitting him with a damp hairbrush around the hall. Him flinching and trying not to get his t-shirt wet, amusement turning to genuine concern as I upended the beer can over his head. I called him every name under the sun. I threatened to have him sectioned. I threatened to phone my mom. I threatened to phone his mom. And then he starts trying to calm me down, face somewhere between confusion and looking like he's made some sort of massive error. "So you haven't been doing this to me?" "Fucking of course I've not been doing this to you, John. There's only one lunatic lurking behind closed doors, and it's the one covered in Asahi Superdry." He becomes upset, remorseful. So apparently at the state of January, every time he's been playing computer games, he thinks I've been standing outside the door spying on him. He's got the sense that I'm angry at him, waiting for him, about to have a go with him. And naturally, not wanting to rise to it, he waits until I go away, and when he finds me, he just sees me doing something else. And there's no anger incoming. It's like I've not even done it. Obviously, he now realized he can't exactly say why he thought I was there. He just had a sense it was me. But he never heard me speak or do anything. Never heard anything at all. And he now feels rather foolish and rather wet because obviously I haven't been. So he chooses to go on a snack run, leaving me in a blanket in the living room. Try and prevent his scared, nervous girlfriend from stabbing him with the kitchen utensils. And this would be fine. I'd have left it at this being my slightly paranoid partner trying to get even, just having a truly dumbass moment, except he said he only started doing this last week, around the 14th. And I had the flu on the 1st, and thinking now, I was only able to hear him doing it in the last week or so I don't know how to tell him this. I don't know how to tell anyone. And I think of my brother towards the end of it all. when he was sat crouched outside my bedroom door, whispering that he was sorry. Except I'm wondering if he didn't mean it like that. His exact words were just that he didn't want this to happen anymore. It needed to stop. And my boyfriend is still out buying every snack under the sun. I mean, I heard his car drive off. And someone is behind the living room door. Set against the raw beauty of Lake Michigan in the late 1800s, if you looked across the water, you would often see a dazzling spectacle. Sleek, three-masted schooners running smoothly on a western wind, day in, day out, before the days of motor vehicles. Almost 2,000 of these prized vessels reliably brought goods for a large portion of the Midwest. However, those placid waters could have a dark side. Often in late autumn, the winds would pick up and the lakes would become death traps for sailors. Prayers would be offered up every time a new voyage went out, but many times they went unanswered. Some say that the Great Lakes were the most treacherous during late November, and perhaps none could testify to that more so than the Rouse Simmons. The Rouse Simmons was built in Milwaukee in 1868 by Allen, McClellan and Company, and named after a Kenosha businessman. After it finished construction, the schooner was soon purchased by a wealthy lumber magnate, Charles H. Hackley, of Muskegon, Michigan, and became just another cog in his large fleet. Hackley's ships served across most of Lake Michigan's coastline, and the Rouse Simmons was no exception, soon transforming into a workhorse, shipping lumber from company mills to several ports around the lake for another 20 years. At its peak, the schooner was making weekly runs between Grand Haven and Chicago. It was the pinnacle of what was considered a large-capacity ship for shallow waters at the time, often tackling over 53 tons of lumber at a time, to the insatiable demand of Chicago's growing industry. And no greater need was there than at Christmas time. It was shrewd businessman Herman Schumann who eventually used the ship for his new venture in trading fine fir trees that had been cut in the northern parts of Ontario. Often he would tout that his prices were lower than any competitors, and he would even give some of the trees to families that couldn't afford them. Some became affectionately endeared to the sailor, and even would call him Captain Santa for his larger-than-life persona during the winter months. He'd be seen taking to the helm himself to make sure that the hull made it to Chicago in time for the holiday. He was a remarkable individual, and one that history will remember, but not for all the reasons you may think. The whole thing started before Herman really had any skin in the game. You see, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the popular German tradition of decorating an evergreen tree in the home was widely practiced, and demand for Christmas trees was great, you see. It was not uncommon for a handful of lake schooners to make late-season runs from northern Michigan and Wisconsin before the worst storms and ice made the lake travel too hazardous. They were loaded with thousands of Christmas trees for busy Chicago waterfront markets. Estimates of the number of Christmas schooners vary, but perhaps up to 24 vessels in any season delivered evergreens to markets in the Great Lakes. Herman saw an opportunity and continued to ship trees even during some of the worst storms. In Chicago, most vessels, including the Rouse Simmons, sold their trees directly from their berths along the Chicago River's Clark Street docks. Electric lights would be strung from the schooner's bow to stern, and customers were invited to board the ship and choose their tree. In addition to selling Christmas trees, many boat operators, including Schumann, made and sold wreaths, garlands, and other holiday decorations. Barbara Schumann and her 3 daughters helped make and sell these items as part of the family's holiday trade. Truthfully, you couldn't find a more Christian family than theirs in that day and age. Although when Captain Santa would face those dangerous waters against the warning of family and friends, one might wonder whether he was truly honoring the blood of Christ and celebrating his birth. The first tragedy hit in 1898. On November 9th of that year, death marred the Schooneman holiday season, when just 1 month after the birth of twins Hazel and Pearl, Herman's older brother, August Schooneman, died while sailing a load of Christmas trees to Chicago aboard the schooner's S-Thal. The 52-ton, two-masted schooner built in Milwaukee in 1867 broke up after it was caught in a storm near Glencloe, Illinois. There were likely dozens of men on board. There were no survivors. The Schooneman family was devastated, but Herman continued the family tradition of making late-season Christmas tree runs, a decision that would soon make fate run its course for him as well. Curiously, August only had obtained the ship mere weeks before the accident, purchasing it on an auction. Some suggested that perhaps he didn't understand how to properly sail the massive boat, as it had been quite some time since he had been a captain. The same was not true for Herman. Even after his brother died, he stayed true to the seas for 3 decades. Even after filing for bankruptcy, he refused to give up what he called his life's calling. The seas would call to him. It would be easy to scoff at the superstitions held by sailors, easy to raise one's eyebrows in amusement when hearing of the omens sailors were convinced would determine their fate, while sailing on the open waters to pass each off with a laugh. But to the men who devoted their lives to shipping, who grasped with white-knuckled hands as their boat was tossed like a bathtub toy during a tumultuous storm, these beliefs were more than mere folklore. They were a matter of life and death. Superstitions were not passed off lightly, but were deeply held beliefs. In the blink of an eye, or waiting for a moment too long, could mean the end of your life. For sailors of the Great Lakes, these superstitions were handed down from generation to generation, passed along by old salts who could read the world around them like a book, who could hear its voice, silent to most, but not to all. Taking note of the happenings on and around a ship was nearly a religious practice. Everything was watched with a trained and careful eye. The sky, the wind, the waves. Many claimed that Captain Santa had heard many omens, that this would be his last voyage. He was not a superstitious man, though, instead choosing to let his fate be chosen by the waves. He was not the only one either that had these ill tidings. Alvida, the daughter of Captain Charles Nelson, who was the partner to Herman, told the Record Herald that her father had a premonition the night before they sailed. Something terrible was going to happen. She pleaded with her father not to sail with Schooneman on that Friday, but Nelson said that he had given his word to Schooneman and could not back out. Captain Charles had been a lake captain for 50 years, and did try to persuade Herman to delay, but he could not convince him. Herman didn't want to take the risk of being iced into the harbor, having his ship dashed against the docks by gale-force winds. Alvida would never see her father alive again. Both men had promised their wives this would be their last run across the lakes. Perhaps it was a foretelling of what was to come. Interviews were made of some of the residents of Thompson, Michigan, near where the Rouse Simmons had docked before making its return trip to Chicago. The residents there said that they loved Captain Schooneman, and the feeling was mutual. Often these were the families he would pass out gifts to, as he was getting ready to leave. In fact, one of his last acts before setting sail to Chicago was to give away candy to the children of the town. He normally would have wrapped presents for them, but with finances being so tight, he admitted this was all he could afford. Some took this as yet another sign that this voyage should be cancelled. A number of residents claimed that they pleaded with Schooneman to not set sail, and to wait out the storm. But according to those interviews, made for a 1975 Milwaukee television documentary, Schooneman stated that the people in Chicago have to have their trees for Christmas. He supposedly said this as he was watching rats deserting his ship. The significance of that would be great if Captain Santa actually knew what the omens meant. Rats are considered by some to be the wisest of mariners. Rodents would often avoid water at all costs. They could scurry around in areas that are largely unseen and inaccessible to humans. You never know what they noticed about this ship. That is probably why when rats leave ships in a hurry, it's considered a bad omen, and in the seafaring circles, one of the worst possible omens, Amos Tackern said in his interview. The mood on the docks was tense and foreboding. Tempers flared. Many were worried because they were leaving on a Friday. According to the Ocean Almanac by Robert Hackerson, the British Navy tried to dispel the Friday superstition in the 1800s when they intentionally laid the keel of a new ship on a Friday, launching it on a Friday, set it to sail on a Friday, and then went so far as to name the ship Friday. What happened next came as little surprise to most. Neither the ship nor her crew was ever heard from again. They vanished into thin air. There were at least 2 sailors who refused to sail back on the Rouse Simmons due to both the impending storms, the Friday schedule, and the fact that the rats were leaving in droves. This was very serious, since the sailors were not paid if they did not complete the voyage. In short, they were returning to their families with nothing. The 2 sailors, some accounts mention 3 sailors, but the exact number is not known, were Hogan Hoganson and Big Bill Sullivan, whose real name was William F. Teets. Hogan Hoganson was interviewed by the Chicago intern Ocean in 1967, and he testified to the fact that he witnessed the rats leaving the ship, and when the younger sailors saw that he was going back by train, they laughed at him. They didn't laugh for long after that, Hogan proclaimed. Perhaps an even stronger portent of this fate was related to the number 13. Of course, it's not merely sailors that say this number is dangerous. Often citing it connects to Judas Iscariot, the one that betrayed Christ. Many sailors have refused to set sail when there are only 13 men aboard, and according to most reports, there were only that many souls aboard when the ship departed for Chicago. On Friday, November 22, 1912, the Rouse Simmons, heavily laden with nearly 5,000 Christmas trees, filling its cargo hold and covering its deck, left the dock at Thompson, Michigan. Some eyewitnesses to its departure claimed the ship looked like a floating forest. It was a startling sight to see it moving across the water like an island alive. Schuneman's choice to go, however, coincided with the beginnings of a tremendous winter storm on the lake that sent several other ships to the bottom, including the South Shore, 3 sisters, and 2 brothers. These ships had all been captained by veterans as well, and yet now found themselves at the bottom of the lakes. This did not deter Herman, though, and he kept going forward despite the clear signs of danger. The temperature immediately dropped from 40 degrees to below freezing. Rain turned to snow and ice, which coated the ship's rigging, sails, and spars, and the Christmas trees that were on the deck. What happened next is a mystery, but it was something seriously unexpected. Something deadly. In their final minutes, the Rouse Simmons had thrown out the schooner's port anchor into Lake Michigan, hoping to hold her into the wind, archaeologists later discovered. Yet nothing could stop Mother Nature from unleashing its fury. Last seen by the Kewanee Life-Saving Station, the Rouse Simmons was flying a distress flag 5 miles offshore while being driven southward by a northwest gale. With no chance of catching the fleeing vessel, the Kewanee Station's captain telephoned the Two Rivers Life-Saving Station, 25 miles to the south. The station immediately launched a lifeboat to intercept the distressed vessel and bring her crew to safety. When the lifeboat motored onto the lake, however, the Rouse Simmons had vanished. In studying historic documents, it was discovered that, contrary to the popular story that materialized around the Simmons' loss, the vessel was under clear conditions. She was not, as legend has it, last seen by the life-saving crew, encrusted with ice, through a fleeting window in a vicious snowstorm. By recreating the search pattern of the Two Rivers lifeboat and comparing it with Rouse Simmons' location to this day, the WHS deduced that the Two Rivers lifeboat completely encircled the Rouse Simmons. It was never more than a few miles from where she lay at the bottom of the lake. With a reported 6 miles of visibility that day, if the ship were still afloat, as the lifeboat rounded Two Rivers Point at 4:20 p.m., the life-saving crew would have seen her. Additionally, the snowstorm that many lake captains reported as the worst they had ever seen may well have been terrible, but it began around 5 p.m., well after the Rouse Simmons would have been on the bottom. In the days following her disappearance, clues were slow to come. Christmas trees, believed to be from the wreck, washed up along the shores of Michigan and Wisconsin that December, and they were brought up in fishing nets for years to come. When the wreck was discovered, further evidence was made to prove that their luck had run out. A horseshoe nailed to the craft with its open end pointing up in order to hold the luck in is one particular item that was found. It is said that if it is upside down or in an inverted U position, it means the ship's luck is running out. Expert scuba diver Gordon Kent Bell Richard, in October of 1971, claimed to find the horseshoe hanging upside down by a single nail. Of course, it's unclear if the horseshoe was in this position before the ship sank, or if it gradually settled in this position after being submerged in 172 feet of water for nearly 60 years. Either way, it did seem as though the aging ship's luck had definitely run out. Not a soul made it off that ship. On the 6th of December 1912, 13 days after the last sighting of the Rouse Simmons, the Milwaukee Sentinel reported that a Captain William Baxter of the Kearsarge heard some vessel sounding its bell just before sighting the vessel. Many sailors believe those to be what are known as phantom bells. The ship's bell was often used to indicate a particular time, or rung a certain number of times for a particular tradition. For example, on New Year's, some sailors would ring the bell 16 times to symbolize they were ringing in the new year and disposing of all the old from the year before. When a sailor died, often they would ring 8 bells to represent the end of the watch. Baxter said he heard no more than 6, inferring that when it echoed, it reminded him of the mark of the wild beast from the Revelations to John. It looked nothing like it had only a few weeks ago. Instead, the masts were ripped and torn. One was completely split in two, and it was moving at a speed not possible for a ship so large. Often these vessels are moving at a steady pace, pushing aside the waves slowly, trying to reach their destination, but this night was different. I saw it race across the horizon, almost like a fire spread over the lake. Baxter refused to speak any further on the incident. It made his entire body shake to its core. Even long after the wreck, for decades, in fact, the ship would be seen. Usually after a storm strong enough to stir up the lake bottom, there would be trees seen on the shores. In the early years, the trees would show up as fresh as the day they were cut, due to being preserved by the frigid Lake Michigan waters. Some claimed it was as though the trees had been protected by the angels themselves. People would gather them up and decorate them for Christmas, saying a prayer of thanks to the ghostly captain that they had delivered them. In much later years, the trees would turn up as skeletons, not a fur left on their branches. But even then, the trees would be cut into thin slices, and then they would be decorated as ornaments. It has often been said that Captain Santa is still delivering his load of Christmas trees, even in death. But not all stories are pleasant ones. An anonymous sailor recounted a story that he had heard from his great-uncle. His great-uncle was born in 1909, just 3 years before the Rouse Simmons was lost. He grew up near the area and would go down to the Point Beach Lighthouse to pick up choke cherries from the trees near there. He told his nephew that people would go down to the lakeshore, usually on Christmas Eve, or Christmas morning, just before dawn, and try to catch a glimpse of the ghost ship during the 1930s. It was described as an old ship with tattered sails that would just bob on the waves. Others said that it was only the bones of the ship, hardly kept together at all except by the sheer spirit of the crew. Someone would see the ship and it would just disappear in a moment. But other times, he said that many people would claim to see a person waving a lighted lantern back and forth on the deck. One resident had this to say: "Tied to the deck by the Christmas lights. They had once been used to decorate the vessel. Now it was proving to be the final chains for the captain that had devoted his life to the sea. It used to come along in a fog when it was abreast of the coast. The breeze would die out. Chill would come over the water, and the vessel passing would seem to shiver as its salts hung idle. The spectre crew stood at the guns, and the foghorn was moaning. They would sometimes be said to be singing Christmas hymns. Be near me, Lord Jesus. I ask thee to stay. Close by me forever, and love me, I pray. Bless all the dear children in thy tender care, and take us to heaven, to live with thee there." And from the masthead flew the sigil, "Cannot rest until avenged." I'll never forget the life that was drained from his eyes. The sheer anger and frustration and pain that the bones held as it sailed across the lake. Doomed to continue to deliver those trees for all eternity because he failed to listen to the warnings given. Barbara Schöneman passed away in 1933 and was buried at Arcadia Cemetery on Irving Park Road in Chicago. Herman's listed on her stone, but his body was never discovered. The only item of his to ever be recovered was a tattered old wallet. Coincidentally, the small harbor ship that found the wallet was called Reindeer, perhaps another omen connected to the horrible holiday season. Two of his daughters, Elise Roberts and Hazel Groneman, are also buried in the plot, alongside their graves, but they're unmarked because of the bankruptcy that struck the family after Herman's death. Barbara did try to continue the tradition of delivering trees even after her husband's death, but because of the massive storm, it caused a change in attitude towards sailing during that time of year. Because of this, Barbara died perhaps more poor than the needy families that she often gave trees to in memory of her husband. The Schöneman stone has a single evergreen tree in the center, and people claim that they can sometimes smell freshly cut Christmas trees when visiting the gravesite. If you have the opportunity to visit the site and walk toward it, you'll likely catch a smell of freshly cut evergreen. Your heart will likely jump a little, just by the unnatural smell, even when it's not holiday time. Some have also said they found a blanket of evergreen branches that were laid upwind on top of a grave that was about 30 feet away and was able to trace the smell to the gravesite. No one knows for sure where it comes from, or even if they are of this world. The wreck of the Rouse Simmons was discovered in 1971, as mentioned before. They found that there were still needleless skeleton-like trees in the cargo hold, the same ones that it was said are found on the grave. In the year that it had disappeared, newspapers ran with the headline that this was a year without Christmas. A note was later found from the first mate of the Rouse Simmons. These lines written at 10:30 p.m., schooner RS, ready to go down about 20 miles southwest of Two Rivers Point, between 15 to 20 miles offshore. All hands lashed to one line. Goodbye. Nelson. Perhaps the darkest message was one found in a bottle from the Rouse Simmons, washed onto the shore at Sheboygan, Wisconsin, sometime after its sinking. It had been corked using a small piece of cut pine tree. How long it had bobbed along the waters is unknown. The message reads, Friday. Everybody, goodbye. I guess we are all through. During the night, The small boat washed overboard, leaking bad. Invald and Steve lost too. God help us. But God did not listen. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I want to let you know a bit more about tonight's author, Jordan Group. Jordan Group is also on YouTube and does narrations of his own work, besides just the narrations that you see here. If you want to find Jordan Group Horror, take a look in the description down below. I have a link over to his YouTube channel, as well as that little eye in the top corner there will also take you over to Jordan Group Horror. Or you can just go over to youtube.com/@JordanGroup, or, you could probably just search Jordan Group inside of your YouTube search bar. But wait, before you go and do that, on with tonight's story. The job of a Yosemite park ranger isn't what most people imagine. I mean, a lot of people picture us as law enforcement type, handing out tickets, enforcing park rules. Really, that's a very niche aspect of it. Mostly, we're just here to assist you, handing out maps, not speeding tickets, and giving people directions to the best views or to ideal camping locations. We remind people about safety and weather conditions from day to day, but the main thing we do, and this is more vital than people realize, is that we're just here in case anyone gets lost or gets hurt. We deal with a lot of belligerent people who like to think the park is their personal playground where they can do whatever they want. I mean, it's my job to remind them to follow the rules, to dispose of their trash properly, to pick up after their dog, and to clip its leash back on while walking the trails. Some people take this as a personal assault on their freedoms, when really I'm just looking out for the safety of other visitors, like cyclists, horseback riders who share the path. Dogs can be unpredictable and can misbehave on trails, and we have to look out for everyone, Still, I don't often get a lot of positive feedback for enforcing the rules. And, I mean, nobody likes to be told what to do. Trust me, I get it. Every once in a while, something interesting happens to break up the boredom and monotony of the job. Every summer, I was walking around at night, doing a patrol of the campgrounds, when I saw something rustling around in the bushes. A guy came crawling out dressed in one of those furry dog costumes. I asked him if he was okay. He just barked happily. Then he crawled back in the opposite direction. Shortly afterwards, I saw him chasing another person who was dressed as a cat. It was a woman who went scampering away and hid underneath a camper van, laughing excitedly and making purring sounds, licking at the dirt from her fur pants with this long tongue. She saw me watching, clawed the air in front of her face, hissing territorially. I mean, that's not it's not how I choose to spend my Friday nights, but I'm not one to judge. By far, the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me at Yosemite occurred last summer. And it wasn't just interesting, it was utterly terrifying. Every night when I fall asleep, I have nightmares about that day. Every time I close my eyes, I picture those dark tunnels in the rock face. It's not how I choose to... It all started when someone called in a report saying that they were out on the Cathedral Lake Trail when their brother went missing. The pair had been out hiking when they got separated somehow. And at first, we thought it was just a routine mishap. I mean, people go missing in Yosemite all the time. It's no big deal in most cases. Since usually the missing parties are found quickly enough, half the time alcohol is involved, and I have to remind people to pace themselves if they indulge while camping. But every once in a while, those missing people don't turn up. We have to dispatch a much larger search party. In this case, I went out on my own at first, heading to where the man had called us from. I drove out on an ATV since it was a 16-mile round trip. When I got there, the guy looked frantic. He ran over to me and started speaking way too fast to understand. I told him to slow down and just give me the facts. It's important to stay calm in these types of situations. The guy took a deep breath and let it out. And he started talking again, a bit slower this time. We were walking on the trail. He was right beside me, and then I turned around to look at the lake, and when I looked back, he was gone. Just fucking gone. I tried to get a sense if the man had been drinking or doing drugs. It's not that I'm trying to assume the worst in people, but we have to think of these types of things. The simplest explanation is usually the right one, after all, and it was much easier to imagine the two brothers taking sips from a Mickey and one of them getting separated and lost than to imagine one of them being abducted by aliens or taken in a very selective rapture. Slow down for a second, okay? Take some deep breaths. What's your name? Let's start with that. Greg, he said, his face turning a shade less purple as he began to inhale air while trembling breaths in and out. Okay, Greg? I took out my notepad, jotting this down along with his last name, which I'll leave out for the sake of privacy. And what's your brother's name? Dave, he said, sniffling. I saw he'd been crying recently. Okay, where was the last place you saw your brother? Let's retrace your steps. He started protesting, saying that it wasn't going to help, but I convinced him we had to at least try. Greg led me back a little ways to where he'd seen his brother last. I walked back here already, and I looked all around before calling you guys. I thought maybe he went off the trail to take a leak, and he tripped and he hit his head. Something like that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws, but I think something... He hesitated. Something what? I probed. Do you think something took him? Like those stories you hear about. He sounded embarrassed, but I tried to get more out of him and asked him which stories he was talking about. You know, the stories about Yosemite and other national parks. I'm sure you've heard about them. Even if you're not in on the conspiracy stories, where people go missing like that, and it makes no sense. Someone turns their back for a second, and then their son or their sister or whoever is just gone, disappeared. Like Dave. I saw it on YouTube. Uh-huh, I replied, not sure what corner of the internet this guy had been visiting. Well, that doesn't happen around here, I can assure you. Let's keep looking. I'm sure it'll turn up. But the longer we looked, the less we found. It really did seem like the man's brother had just up and vanished. I was about to call in for more support, maybe even a canine unit, when the man yelled from a little ways off the trail saying he'd found something. Following the sound of his voice, I eventually came to him at the base of the mountain, face to face with this granite wall. At first I didn't understand what he was doing there, but as I got closer I saw there was actually a cave which was well hidden in the rock face. It blended in perfectly with the mountainside until you were almost nose to nose with the pale gray stone. Good job, I said, patting him on the shoulder. But then I looked at our surroundings, getting nervous. We were pretty far from the path, in the thick part of the forest, which was overgrown and tangled with vines and shrubbery. Do you think he would have gone into the cave on his own? Greg looked around, as if checking to see if his brother had left a message for him, but there was nothing. I don't think so. It's not like him to just leave me on the trail alone, either, especially not for this long. If this was a prank or something, he'd have to come back by now. I can tell something's not right. Has your brother played pranks on you like this before? I asked. The man was in his 20s. And his brother was probably of a similar age. Young men occasionally get lost or injured trying to scare each other by pulling pranks or filming videos in the woods. It was rare, but it had happened before. Once or twice, he admitted. I didn't call you guys for a while because I thought he was messing with me, I wouldn't put it past him, but not for this long. I was getting annoyed. Mosquitoes were biting my neck, and I was sweating in the heat of the afternoon, after marching through the foliage for hours. I imagined the guy hiding inside the cave, trying to scare his younger brother. Maybe he had fallen asleep in his dark hiding place, or he was pushing it too far. But either way, I was upset. If this was a prank, it had wasted most of my afternoon. Probably annoyed me even more because I had my own older brother who had played tricks on me more than once in my younger days. And this was bringing back memories. All right, you can come out of there right now, I yelled, marching into the cave, thinking the young man would be hiding in the small alcove. I turned a corner and saw a dark tunnel leading deep into the darkest recesses of the granite. This made no sense. As far as I knew, there was no tunnel in this location, especially not one of this size. But it had been well hidden, nearly invisible in the rock face. I wondered if anyone knew about it. Wondered if it was safe. I didn't feel comfortable going any further. The dark space looked like it went on for a long, long way into the distance, and I was getting an eerie feeling standing there. Felt like I could almost hear voices whispering from all around me. The words were lost in the echoing cave. I got a strong sensation that we weren't alone, like icy fingers walking slowly up my spine. The other man came in behind me, marveling at the cave for a second before continuing to press forward. "Come on," Greg said, forging ahead. "You might be in trouble." He was anxious to keep going, not scared enough of this horrifying place with whispering voices coming from the shadows, and his apparent lack of fear made me twice as scared. "I'm going back for help," I said, shuffling backwards. "It isn't safe. Nobody knows we're here." My training and my instincts were overwhelming my curiosity, but Greg seemed not to care about the dangers. The man continued going forward, disappearing into the darkness. A few seconds later, he was gone. There was no indication he had ever existed in the first place. "Greg?" I called out into the black abyss. There was no response. He might as well have been a ghost. An overwhelming urge to follow him rushed over me, and I took a few steps forward, feeling hypnotized by the black tunnel leading on and on forever. But then I shook my head, slapping my face as I tried to wake myself from whatever trance I was in, which was overruling my common sense. I turned around and I left the cave, my legs shaking and my hands unsteady as I called for assistance. After meeting the search party back at the trail, we went through the woods again to find the cave hiding within the 10,000-foot-tall rock face of Cathedral Peak. But it was gone. I remember having trouble finding it the first time and thinking it was well hidden amongst the pale gray surface of that mountainside, but you had to be nearly face to face with the wall to see it, since it was so invisible amongst the crags and the boulders. I tried to tell my supervisor and the other members of the search party, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no tunnel there. They looked for hours, they found nothing. Helicopters swept the area, more teams with more dogs, bloodhounds, German shepherds, but nothing was turned up. There was no trace of anyone having been out there except me. Dumbfounded for the rest of the week, and for the rest of the summer, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to the conversation I'd had with a man on the trail named Greg. The man who'd lost his brother and then disappeared into a cave that didn't exist. More and more, I began to wonder, what would have happened if I'd followed him? It took a full year for me to build up the courage to go back out into the exact spot again. It happened to be on the same date and around the same time of day. Only this time, I wasn't on duty. It was my weekend off, so I had plenty of time to comb the area for clues. My backpack had plenty of provisions, and I had enough to last for a night or two in the woods, maybe longer if necessary. Somehow, I just had a feeling that if I went back on that day, at that time, it would be there. The cave that didn't exist. Cathedral Peak loomed above me, getting larger as I made my way through the forest, moving towards it. The gray clouds above were shrouding the sun in darkness, while the thickening canopy blocked any remaining light from overhead. A chill ran through me, causing me to shiver involuntarily as I laid eyes on the black hole in the rock face, so plain and clear to see now. Taking a step forward, I found myself standing right in front of it, and I reached up my hand to feel the outline of the entryway, as if to confirm it was real. It was. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to submerge, and I went inside. The air was cold and damp with a strange coppery smell. My flashlight was on my belt, and I grabbed it, but then decided not to turn it on. I was getting a strange feeling. Like I was in an unsafe place and needed to stay silent and hidden. There was a sound coming from up ahead which I couldn't place. It was a slurping, chewing sound, like someone tearing meat from bones with their teeth. As I went deeper and deeper into the tunnel, the air became colder, and so damp that I felt droplets of water running down my face and into my eyes. A trickle of light was filtering in somewhere as well, causing the cavern to faintly glow in places. The air seemed to shimmer and dance in front of my eyes as I went deeper and deeper, feeling entranced as I stumbled along in the shadows. Faintly, I realized that there was something wrong with me. As if I had been drugged, but I no longer cared. In fact, I found the sensation to be quite pleasant. And then I was abruptly awoken from my daydream as I came around a corner and saw the horror unfolding within the guts of Cathedral Peak. I can't begin to explain what I saw down there, and the shadows obscured most of it, drenching the monstrous creature in darkness, but the impression that I got was of something like an octopus or a squid crossbred with an oversized plant or fungus, sucking and slurping, chewing and crunching something beneath its teeth. After a few moments of inspection, I realized it was a person's face that was being eaten, as if the details could just barely be seen in the dim light of the cave. The skin was being stripped from its cheek, and the eyelids ripped off, and the lips peeled back and slurped up through the noodles. Tentacles like tangled vines were everywhere, slithering and sliding across the pale gray stone floors around me. At first I thought it was mud beneath my feet, but as I came fully to my senses, I realized it was blood, mingling and mixing with the dust beneath my feet, creating a dark, toxic red slurry which sucked at my boot heels. The tentacle vine things were everywhere, I realized with numb shock. My feet were actually stepping on some of them. I was amazed the creature hadn't noticed me yet, but it was obviously too caught up with whatever meal it was currently ingesting. Feeling very glad I hadn't turned on my flashlight, I began to back away very slowly, my boots crunching across the writhing tentacles. A sick knot in my stomach was rising up and threatening to make me puke. Fear and revulsion twisting my gut. My mind was spinning and my thoughts were racing, understanding there was a very good chance I would never leave this place. I tried desperately not to step on any more of the squirming, writhing tentacles which moved and twisted on the floor of the cave, soaking and basking in the blood which had spilled everywhere, like pigs rolling happily in the mud. There was no possible way there could be so much of it, I thought. No one person has this much blood. I mean, this was a river. And then I saw the others. They were hanging suspended from the ceiling, from the walls, from everywhere. Amidst the purple vine tentacles, they breathed in and out, still being kept alive, but just barely. Dozens of them were strung up and down the length of the cave, their chests writhing and falling with weak breaths, but none of them opening their eyes or speaking. It was like they were sleeping. After a few long moments of searching, I found him. Greg, the hiker from the trail who was looking for his brother. He was hanging upside down from the walls just beside me, his eyes closed. Parts of him were missing. A piece of his cheek, part of his hand. But the wounds were slowly healing. The creature, whatever it was, it kept their victims alive down here, I realized. It was ingesting them slowly, perhaps even using pieces of its other victims as nutrients to feed the ones who were dying of starvation, like an otherworldly pyramid scheme built of blood and human remains. Shaking the mental image away, I grabbed Greg's shoulder, hoping to wake him up quietly. His eyes shut open a second after I touched him, revealing only the whites. And he began to screech. And I don't mean screeching like he was screaming out of fear or of pain or anything like that. It was an inhuman alarm cry, which signified to me immediately there was no shred of humanity left in him. He was now a part of this hive mind of a creature and its tentacle army. As his head turned on a swivel, I saw smaller tentacles that were wrapped around him, going into his brain, into his neck, invading his ears and his eyes, drilled into his spinal column. I screamed involuntarily, seeing these details, and heard the creature in the tunnel as it recognized my presence. It wasn't fast, whatever it was, but it was huge. The cave shook around me, dust and pebbles falling from the ceiling above as I backed away from the hiker. Beneath my feet, the vines were suddenly moving quickly, sliding around so that I couldn't find my balance. As soon as my shoes found purchase on the stone floor beneath me, I began to run. The tunnel was alive all around me now, the whipping of vines, the twisting and the bending towards me, reaching out like greedy hands, trying to grab me as I raced past. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the amorphous creature's central girth was finding its way through the cave, and it was moving my way a lot faster than I would have thought possible. But then again, I wouldn't have thought any of this was possible before living it. The light of the entryway was just up ahead. I could smell the fresh air. I could see the sun. And then my feet suddenly slipped as if someone had pulled a rug out from under me, and I was crashing to the ground face first. My jaw closed hard, and I bit the end of my tongue, causing it to bleed, the taste of copper filling my mouth a second later. I tried to get to my feet. The mental image of those poor trapped people could be seen clearly in my mind's eye. And in retrospect, I think the creature, whatever it was, needed us to be unsuspecting. If we were aware of what it was doing, this hypnosis that it had, it wouldn't work. Maybe it was a chemical that it released which caused people to want to explore the cave, a pheromone like insects use to communicate, but it didn't work as well if you knew about it, and if you understood its purpose. It released some more of that pheromone or whatever chemical that it was using to lure people in, and I actually felt my legs grow a bit heavier. My eyelids, too. It was like I had suddenly just worked 3 night shifts, and I really needed to sleep. But then the wave of hypnosis passed, and I felt the rumbling of the ground beneath me, and that broke me from the trance again, causing me to scramble to my feet from the cave floor and run. As I neared the cave entrance and I sprinted towards it, leaving my backpack far behind in an effort to lighten the load, I saw the rocks were actually closing in, tightening the gap. The entryway was shrinking somehow. It was the vines. It was the vines, I realized. They were what was camouflaging the entrance. Their color changed to match the pale gray stone. I picked up my pace, the twisting forms beneath me making it even more difficult. I didn't dare risk a glance over my shoulder, feeling the rumbling of the floor, knowing that the bulk of the creature was just behind me, closing in. With the gap of the exit narrowing even further, shrinking to the size of a dartboard, I dove headfirst into it, imagining my face slamming into a sheer rock wall as it suddenly turned to stone right in front of me, sealing me in this dark labyrinth of suffering forever with the rest of these tortured souls. My eyes were squinted tightly shut as I felt the vines pulling and tearing at me as I went violently through the gap. For an instant, they squeezed in around my midsection, threatening to stop me like Winnie the Pooh after an unfortunate attempt at pilfering honey. When I popped out of the hole, and it sealed up behind me in an instant. I heard a loud crash as the creature flew headlong into its own obstruction. The trap it had created to keep me there had hindered its escape, preventing it from chasing after me. I could hear it thrashing and clawing at the vines, desperate for more flesh to sustain itself. However, whatever it was growing too large even for its own control, let alone to feed in the heart of the mountain. It would eventually destroy itself. It would consume its own flesh to sate its monstrous hunger, like a snake eating its own tail. I had a very strong suspicion that it was true. And with that very specific idea in mind, I wandered back to my car. It was easier now without the backpack and all the gear, but the walk back to the cave would be harder. There'd be lots to carry next time. After a trip to the hardware store, I went back out to the trail. It was nighttime now, and the place was abandoned. I borrowed one of the Ranger ATVs and took my supplies out to the spot where the cave had been. After bringing a few buckets of water from the lake, I began my work. Since I had marked the cave, it was easy to find it again, and I began laying down the fast-drying cement. As park rangers, our job is usually to stop people from vandalizing mountains, in this exact way. But I got the feeling Mother Nature would forgive me. It was my job to protect this place and the people within it. Nothing could protect people from this thing. It was best just to seal it away forever. Let it slowly consume itself. Without a fresh supply of hikers, he would eventually run out of calories. He would eventually expire. It was only a matter of time. The vine tentacles squirmed beneath a layer of cement, groggily reaching out for me, trying to pull me in. I grabbed the towel and slopped on another thick coating, watched as it rapidly began to dry, and the tentacles began to smooth out and settle down again, falling back asleep. That inhuman shriek could be heard from inside again, much louder this time, as if all the hikers who the creature had abducted had all woken up at the same instant. And for just a second, they realized their predicament. Sorry, Greg, I muttered to myself, alone in the dark forest. I told you not to go in there. I'm a nurse in one of the most renowned children's hospitals in the country. I've worked here for almost 8 years, and I can only say it stands true to its title. The pay's good, I get along with my coworkers without much problems. Everything's perfect in the hospital except for one thing. And that's Rizzo, the hospital clown. When I joined this hospital, I was told by my fellow colleagues about this rumor that's been circulating the hospital since its establishment. The rumor's about a certain clown named Rizzo, weird name, right? Who roams the hospital and visits sick kids. None of the adults have ever seen him, but so many children have seen him over the years that it can't be considered an elaborate prank. So when they told me about him, I thought, they were just trying to tease me for being a newbie. And I took it as a joke. I said, yeah, perhaps Cinderella visits on Sundays too. They gave each other a look and left the topic at that. I got busy with work and completely forgot about our conversation. In my 3rd week at the hospital, I was doing the morning checkup on every patient on the floor when I entered Kevin's room. He was awake, and he was smiling from ear to ear. Good morning. Why are you up so early? I asked. The clown came to me at night. He was so funny when he entered the room. His pants fell, and he duck-walked to my bed because he was juggling balls. He couldn't pull his pants back up. Kevin replied in one breath, still smiling, as if remembering the last night's event. I remembered the conversation with my colleagues and thought perhaps they'd set up an elaborate prank by involving this kid. This was going too far. I was a bit mad, so I quickly finished the checkup and went to confront my coworkers. Her name was Emily, and she'd been working here for 13 years. She was the one who told me about the clown, so naturally I thought she was the culprit behind the prank. She was in the lunchroom drinking a cup of coffee. Okay, you need to stop with the prank. It's gone far too long, and it isn't funny, I said, approaching her table. What are you talking about? What prank? She asked, looking at me with a confused look. I rolled my eyes and said, don't act naive. You told me about the clown to scare me or whatever, and you even involved a child to play the part in your prank? She stopped sipping on her coffee and gave me an odd look, and said in a serious tone, explain from the beginning. So I did. I told her how I was going to the routine rounds and told everyone about my little chat with Kevin. After I was done, I looked at her for an explanation. She just sipped her coffee and stared at the table. Her face looked a little paler from when I'd entered the room, and I noticed her hands shaking a little. I stood there impatiently and was about to speak when she spoke. The clown's real. She continued. You can ask anyone from the staff. It isn't a prank or a test for new workers. The clown is real. Or as real as any ghost can be. A ghost? I was a bit shocked by her saying that. I mean, I didn't believe in ghosts. I think the concept of them was created to scare children. Yes. I don't know how to properly explain, but it's been here since before I joined. No one knows who he is, where he came from. All I know is he can be seen by children only. We've tried to capture him in CCTV, but there's no evidence of clowns in any footage. He visits patients randomly. We can't figure out any pattern in his visitations. He visits the patients, makes them laugh, talks to them, and leaves. So he's just a friendly clown that entertains children while they're sick. I mean, what, a friendly ghost? I said jokingly. So it seems, replied Emily. But we always pray that no child ever sees that fucking clown. Why? She took a deep breath and looked at me in the eyes before saying, He's the harbinger of death. Whenever he visits someone, the patient dies within 2 days of seeing him. So all of us pray none of the patients ever see him. But now that he's made an appearance... Poor Kevin. It took a moment to understand what she was saying. So you're saying Kevin will die within 2 days? She nodded. You know, I almost believed your story, but now I know you're full of shit. We just successfully removed his appendix. There's no real threat to his life. I mean, in fact, he's getting discharged today. So you're saying a kid with no problems, no serious health problems, will die within 2 days just because an imaginary clown visited him. That's ridiculous. Emily just stared while I was ranting. And when I finished, she got up and left the room. While passing me, she said, You'll realize soon enough. I stood there for a minute, and then I left the room to continue my work. Just to make sure, I visited Kevin's room and checked in on him again. He was doing perfectly fine and was eager to go home. At 1 p.m., he was discharged from the hospital. And the next day, he was dead. His mother had gone to the supermarket for groceries while his dad was at work. He was watching YouTube on his phone when she left, and when she returned, she called him to help with carrying in the groceries. But he never answered. She went to her room. She saw him lying on the bed. She called him again, but didn't stir, and she rushed to check on him, but he wasn't breathing. She called an ambulance. But it was too late. The paramedics declared that he was dead. I was beyond shocked when I learned about the news. He was doing well when he left yesterday. I inquired about the cause of death, and apparently the cause of his death was unknown. While I was still processing this information, I came across Emily. From the look on your face, I guess you've heard about Kevin's death. I warned you this was going to happen, but you didn't believe me. I was getting angry as she spoke, as if she was the reason Kevin died. I mean, if she hadn't told me about the clown, Kevin would still be alive. I looked up and I was about to yell at her. When I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't trying to be mean. She was sad. She continued. This is your first time, right? I've seen dozens of these deaths throughout my career. I was unable to stop them even when I knew about them, so I know how you're feeling. Is there a way to stop him? I asked. She shook her head. No. If there was, why would I have kept it a secret? Then why is this hospital still open? Why doesn't management close this hospital if we can't stop the clown from killing these poor kids? Because Rizzo only appears in front of 3 or 4 children in a year. As you know, this is one of the best children's hospitals in our country. We save thousands of lives every year. If we shut down, what will happen to them? Setting up this kind of hospital will take a lot of time, take money. And still there's no guarantee that Rizzo won't follow to the new hospital. That we should forcibly shut the hospital down. We should inform the media, or at least parents of these children. If they know, nobody will bring their child to the hospital, and then the clown will never appear. Did you believe me when I told you about the clown? I was silent. You didn't. Same will happen if we inform the world. No one's going to believe it. I mean, a clown no one can see except children, and they die after seeing it. People will think it's just a publicity stunt to attract people's attention towards the hospital. Besides, some of these children require expert medical treatments. which only we can offer. So some parents may bring their children, even if they know about the clown, just to save their lives. I'd seen some of these kids who would die if they weren't in our hospital. I was feeling helpless. I wasn't sure what I should do. You should try to save as many of these kids as you can. The clown will take a few, but you should try to focus on the patients that you've saved through your work. This may help you a little to keep you sane. And with that, she left me standing there alone to continue her work. I stood there for a while, thinking about her words. I decided then and there that I'll follow her. Try to save as many patients that I can, no matter how much time it takes. Years passed. I threw myself into work. During the first 6 years of my work, Rizzo appeared 23 times in front of children. All 23 of them died. The last 2 years, Rizzo didn't appear at all. Me and everyone else thought that he'd left for good. But all of our hopes shattered today. There were 283 patients in the hospital last night. He appeared in front of all of them. Every home has a little man in a cupboard, and his door shouldn't ever be opened. I lived in this house for 10 years, but I only discovered a miniature man who's no larger than a thumbtack pin a couple of weeks ago. You said that every home has this little man, but I've never seen him, you scoff. Well, I should hope not, but that doesn't mean that he isn't there. Most people are simply fortuitous enough to never happen upon him, and the little man is hard to find. You should be thankful for that. He loves all manner of lightless hovels, and nobody can say which one he might choose. Kitchen cupboards, bathroom cupboards, even cupboard cupboards. Cupboard cupboards? Well, let's start at the beginning of my story. It was a wintry Wednesday evening. Anna, my girlfriend, was staying the night. There was little to no appropriate food in my flat, apparently, so I was rummaging through kitchen cupboards to find a snack that she might enjoy. "What goodies have you got at the back there, Kieran?" Anna asked. "Mold. Dead vermin, probably," I laughed. "Have a look." In the farthest corner of the cupboard, I was unsurprised to find a sealed box of Pop-Tarts that had expired in 2014. I smirked and started waving the packaging in front of Anna's horrified face. She squinted at the expiry date and grimaced. 9 years old, really? Bachelor pads are the worst. "I'm sure they'll be fine," I jokingly insisted. "Like a fine wine. They're better with age. Staleness gives them some crunch." I'm more horrified by the clutter in that cupboard. "I suppose expired treats are a good sign that you're not gorging on snacks, but we need to tidy up your kitchen," Anna said. "That sounds like a riveting activity for a Wednesday evening, but I think I'll pass," I replied, placing the expired Pop-Tarts on the kitchen counter. That was when I saw it. The cupboard at the back of the cupboard. The kitchen light reflecting off of a pea-sized, polished brass handle on a bottle cap-sized door. I can only imagine the concealed compartment had always lurked at the back of my cupboard, but I was absolutely certain that I'd never seen it. When I moved into the house and filled my kitchen with food, I surely would have noticed a cupboard within a cupboard. "What in the name of bloody bars is this mess?" I asked, ushering Anna to come and see. She ducked down and shone her phone flashlight into the tiny circular door. Anna snorted. "It's either that or the home of a very, very, very small hobbit. How long have you been working on that prank, huh?" "I didn't put it there," I replied. With a childlike sense of wonder, I delicately placed the nails of my thumb and forefinger on either side of the brass handle. It was incredibly difficult to latch onto the whimsically tiny thing, and without any thought or care, I swung the door open. I'm not entirely sure what I expected to find, but it certainly wasn't another cupboard. Yet the tiny storage space wasn't what intrigued me. there was a small man inside. Now, to be accurate, Anna and I didn't really know that it was a man at first. Not a real man, anyway. He was a dollhouse figurine, but he was a quarter the size of a typical figurine. The little man was seemingly made of painted resin, sported a black suit with a wooden cane. Unsettlingly, he was facing the back of his tiny cupboard. Why the heck did the previous owners leave a creepy little doll in a creepy little cupboard? Anna asked, shuddering. Oh, we don't know that he's creepy, I chuckled. He's not even said hello to us yet. I pinched the figure's head between my nail and twisted him around to face us. He had the face of a conservative 1950s man. Slick back brown hair, clean-shaven, disturbing smile. The little man seemed intent on delivering a sweet and endearing expression, but he simply looked crooked. I don't like that false grin, Anna said, squinting at his tiny face. And his eyes are just so... Featureless pinpricks, I teased. Spooky? Thanks for that. Well, you've settled it. No horror movie tonight. We're watching Great British Bake Off, Anna said. Suits me, I said, following Anna to the living room. Nothing scarier than Paul Hollywood. Halfway through the first episode, I leapt from the sofa and returned to the kitchen for a glass of water. Whilst my glass was filling up, I realized I hadn't shut the door to the snack cupboard, and when the glint off the little shiny brass handle caught my eye, I realized I hadn't shut the tiny man's cupboard door either. I bent down to shut both doors, but I immediately found myself eyeballing the little man with the purple bow tie. He was once again facing away from me. After twisting him to face us, I didn't return him to his original position. Well, I didn't remember doing that. Still, I shrugged my shoulders and assumed I must have done it without thinking. Suddenly aware of the overflowing glass of water that I left in the sink, I hopped to my feet, turned off the tap, and taking my glass back to the lounge, I realized that my sieve brain once again had forgotten to remind me to close both cupboards, so I crouched down to try again. I dropped my glass to the floor and it smashed to pieces. Anna came running to the room to make sure I was all right. I wasn't. His motionless body was still facing the back of his miniature cupboard. However, he had rotated his head to face me, and, frighteningly, placed his hands over his eyes. All that could be seen of his see-no-evil face was the smile that I, much the same as Anna, did not like. Is that the same figure? Anna asked, peering into the cupboard that had petrified me. Yeah, I vacantly replied. How many of these little men do you have lying around? She asked. This really doesn't seem like the mood of a date night, you know? Terrified and confused, I shut both the small and the normal-sized cupboard door. I told Anna I was suddenly coming down with a migraine and wanted to sleep. But in reality, I lay in bed for hours, failing to comprehend what I had seen in the cupboard. I mean, Anna couldn't have teased me by replacing the figure. She hadn't even left the sofa. The little man had moved of his own accord. On Thursday morning, I woke to the sound of a door slamming, and when I rolled over, there was an empty space beside me in bed. Anna had already left to go to work. Still too afraid to leave my bedroom after the unexplainable horrors of the night before, I closed my eyes to catch a few more ticks of sleep. Still half asleep, I hadn't even mustered the energy to open my eyes before something utterly horrifying happened. My right eyelids were forcibly pried apart. There, standing like a titan less than a millimeter in front of my right eyeball, was the little man from the cupboard. He was no longer a statue. He was lifting my upper eyelid like a heavy shop shutter and standing on my bottom eyelid for support. I screamed soundlessly, too frightened to make any sudden movement. The insect man unsheathed the needle-sized blade from his cane. Unlike him, it wasn't made of resin. I realized that as soon as he plunged the narrow tool into my eye. I screeched until I felt my vocal cords might snap. Reflectively, I shut my right eyelid together, but the little man resisted, using his free hand and both of his legs to keep my eyelid apart. The little figurine persisted, piercing my eyeball. Despite the microscopic size of the blade, it was sufficient to inflict the brutal bursts of pain. But I was more terrified by my distorting and blackening vision. He was blinding me. Whacking my eyeball aggressively, I eventually knocked the little man along with his needle onto my duvet. With not a moment to waste, I threw the covers off of me and bounced onto my feet, clutching my bleeding right eyeball. I scooped up my phone and sprinted out of the bedroom. Stumbling down the main hallway, I managed to flee my apartment. Flicking through my phone to ring Anna, however, I saw that I already had numerous missed calls from her. On top of that, she had sent me a wall of messages on WhatsApp. I stopped in my place to get things before work, and guess what I found in my bathroom cupboard? A fucking dollhouse door. Very funny, Kieran. I'm not mad. I'm actually impressed that you managed to orchestrate all of this. Bravo. Another cute little doll, too. Whoa. How many of them did you put in this cupboard? There's a different one looking at me now. This isn't funny. How are you doing this? It fucking moves. The messages end on that incomplete note. Looking at the timestamps of the many missed calls, I saw that they started a few minutes after the messages ended. Anna had rung me for a period of 10 minutes until 9 in the morning, and I left the apartment at 9:05. Heart beating in my chest, I feared what that might mean, so I slid into the driver's seat of my car, scorched rubber on my frantic race to Anna's place. It was only a 5-minute drive. I didn't waste any time when I showed up. I left the car running and I broke down Anna's flimsy, wafer-thin door with 3 well-meaning kicks. Calling her name throughout the apartment, I was haunted by the stillness of her home. Not a movement, not a sound. I bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. There was the faint sound of bumping and scratching within the bathroom, almost imperceptible. Shaking at the side of the open door, I held my breath, and I stepped inside. No sign of Anna. I timidly peered around the side of her shower curtain. She wasn't in there, and that was when I heard another bump. It came from the white bathroom cabinet beneath Anna's sink. Of course, the one place I didn't want to inspect. After seeing her messages, perhaps I had avoided it on purpose. I knelt on the bathroom tiles and fearfully stretched my unwilling hand towards the 2 door handles. In a rapid motion, like removing a band-aid, I opened the 2 doors. Unfathomable horror. I caterwauled at the gruesome sight within the cupboard. Tears streamed down my face and inhuman noises spilled from my mouth. I rocked on my knees and felt myself slowly succumbing to insanity at the maddening sight before me. Anna was, by the laws of some unearthly physics, crumpled into the tiny bathroom cabinet. It was an inexplicable, insidious, contortionist act, and his limbs were mangled so unthinkably out of shape that her bones had been splintered and snapped like twigs. The most horrendous part of the memory is that she wasn't dead. She was twitching ever so slightly, painfully gasping for air. Her face was even more horrific, and his eyes had been sliced repeatedly. They were little more than 2 bloody mounds of mush. She had been violently blinded. If I hadn't managed to fend off the little man, I imagined I would have met the same fate. I placed a hand on Anna's cheek, hoping that she knew I was there with her. She took her final breaths. Minutes later, responding to a noise complaint, the police arrived. As incriminating as the scene looked, I was spared the pain of prison. My brother's a lawyer, it's a small town, everyone knows everyone. Plus, witness accounts mentioned sounds of a struggle emanating from Anna's apartment about 10 or 20 minutes before they saw me arrive in my car. People believe the killer fled before I broke down the door, and, they weren't wrong. They just couldn't possibly believe the truth. Anna's parents held a small memorial ceremony at their house last night. And why am I mentioning this? Why isn't the story over yet? Well, Anna's father commented on finding something in a cluttered cabinet, a dollhouse man. The figurine was standing on a pile of old books. There's no minuscule door that I could have warned Anna's father to avoid. I mean, it was too late. The little man was in the midst of the vast, empty storage space. He was looking away from us. You know to avoid cupboards, but no cupboard can safely be opened. The little man can visit anyone, anywhere, anytime. He hides in every home. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm just going to give you a quick warning that I never really do on any of my stories, but it felt appropriate here. This story deals a lot with prison life, and as prison life goes, there's quite a few things I don't normally touch on, like very gross situations and sexual violence. So, listener discretion advised. And now, on to tonight's story. I was jolted awake about an hour ago, confused and disoriented. My heart was pounding and my sheets were soaked in sweat. Some slavering, malevolent horror was in the trailer with me, creeping up on me while I slept with poised claws and razor teeth. The absolute certainty of this coated my mouth with a metallic taste of fear, sour and dry and thick. I grabbed the baseball bat that laid beneath my cot and tiptoed around the cramped darkness of my trailer, straining to hear over the keening of the wind outside and the pounding of my own heart. Of course, there was nothing here except my goldfish and yours truly, the sweaty guy in his underwear. It was the gusting wind that startled me awake. Happens quite often in the late autumn and early winter. The wind rips through the scrub of skeletal trees that surround the trailer park. It charges with a lion's roar into our lonely huddle of frail little shelters. It gibbers and shrieks and pounds on our walls and uses fists of dead leaves and frozen grit. Satisfied I wasn't about to become chow for some unspeakable creature, I laid back down on my squeaky, saggy old cot and tried to get back to sleep. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself thinking about that night in the penitentiary. The night of the lockdown. I kept thinking about Mikey and Big Rob and the rest of them. All of us huddled in a cell with the lights off and the frigid northwest winds howling at the walls. After a while, I gave up trying to sleep. Instead, I sat down in front of the computer and I started typing. I'm no storyteller. Not like Mikey or Hutch. But I'll try my best. When I first came to the pen, the thing that struck me the most about the place was just how much the cons talked. On the occasion when I'd served time in the county jail, there'd been talk, sure, but it was tense and impersonal. When they're only serving a few months, I guess a lot of people feel the situation's too temporary to bother forging any ties with any of their fellow inmates. You'd play cards with your cellies, you'd sit in the day room and watch TV in relative silence. The only time there'd be any noise or action was when a scrap broke out over a card game. Fights were the only thing that passed as excitement in county. Every other moment of the day was comprised of dull, boring nothing. Going in, you just hoped that the food wouldn't be too bad. Your cellie wouldn't end up being a gang member or a meth head biker waiting out a long patch of dead time. People, in other words, people who might beat the shit out of you as a way to pass the hours. The pen, though, it's an incredibly noisy, smelly, vocal environment. I remember very clearly the moment when my little group of new arrivals, we were all let out of the fish tank and into our new home. A pod housing 200 inmates. Son, I was overwhelmed by the deafening din of voices and activity when the hacks marched us, bundles in hand, out onto the range. Of course, there was the obligatory cat calls, wolf whistles, but most of the cons seemed completely oblivious to us. They were busy living the ebb and flow of the penitentiary life. course, not exactly true. Cons see everything, and I mean everything. But they talk even more. My first cellie wanted both my bail and my ass in that order. Wasn't happening. Hammered in the mouth and it was on. The fight spilled out of the cell and into the corridor of the pod. He was a big, tough old bull, but I had him leaking and his confidence was shaken. Before the COs got us, I'd managed to get the nasty old fuck face down on the floor, and I was whamming away at the back of his head and neck like a jackhammer. And the hacks got there, and one of them laid a size 12 boot upside my skull. The kick knocked my brain clear over the moon. The world immediately went out of focus and stayed that way for almost 12 hours. Spent the next 3 weeks in the hole for fighting. When I got out, I was placed in a different pod. Word had gotten around the fish wasn't exactly new. They had a mean right cross. No one bothered to try and roll up on me in the yard that day. When I sat down at chow with my new cellie and some of his boys, no one objected. I'd been checked. I passed the test. I wasn't a punk or sissy. I could sit with the men. Yeah, it's a different world. Pen is. That's wildly different rules. You couldn't fully understand unless you've been there. It wasn't long before I settled into a routine. Up for head count and chow, off to work in the laundry, chow, nap, workout, chow, then the struggle to fill the dead hours between supper and lights out. There wasn't much to do. The cons played cards, betting with tobacco bales purchased from the commissary, individual hand-rolled smokes. Some watched TV, others watched the wall. Some watched each other. Tensions were always high between the rival gangs. Dope fiends spiked what they liked to spike in the bathrooms. And there was, of course, a lot of talk. Talk of family back home. Women had and lost. Misdeeds proudly done. There were enough stories flying around that place to fill a library. My cellie was an old con named Mikey. He'd originally been sentenced to 15 years of second-degree murder during a robbery, but he had gotten into so much trouble since landing in the pen that he'd managed to acquire an additional 10 years on top of that. Mikey was doing all day, and he'd made peace with that fact. Good cat, all in all. Straight shooter, he didn't fuck with the spike. The thing was, he'd kill just about anyone, if he got it into his head that he wanted to. In early years, Mikey had been a trigger man for the bikers. He'd been convicted of murders of 6 people, was a suspect in 16 others. And I can imagine that a number of them had probably been friends of his at one point or another. In certain circles, a good friend can become your murderer in the blink of an eye. It's the kind of people you do time with in maximum security. Mikey and his crew liked nothing better than to spend a Sunday evening crowded up in someone's cell, drinking, shooting the shit. Personally, I didn't care much for the hooch. It tasted like rotting garbage with a heavy fruit bouquet. The stories were welcome. When Mikey or one of his homeboys was on a roll, we could all forget ourselves and be somewhere else for a little while. As far as cons go, they were good fucking guys. They were, and these bull sessions were the glue that held Mikey's crew together. I remember watching and listening for hours on end, spellbound, as Mikey or Big Rob or whoever wove a tapestry of words in the thin air around us. It'd make us roar with laughter, clench in rage, even slightly choke up on sadness. Some of the guys could play a man's emotions like a violin with their storytelling. Masters of the form. Most of the time, the stories were pretty coarse, which was to be expected. Look where they were coming from. And occasionally, they were downright fucking horrifying. There's one in particular that I can remember word for word, quite literally. I can actually close my eyes, I can see Mikey and Rob, Hutch, the rest of them, sitting there in the cell that night. All of us bathed in the sickly red glow of the emergency lights, transfixed by what we were being told. This particular story likes to pop up in my head in the small dead hours of the night. When the harsh winds of drab old November lash and rock my rusty little trailer hard enough to wake me up, as they did tonight. Coincidentally, it was on a November night just like this when I heard this story. It's about a year into my 4-year sentence for armed robbery, and this is my second winter in the pen. I recall the goddamn wind was cutting through the walls really badly that night, and the drafts were freezing our toes solid. It had been a murder that day. Old pen was on lockdown, all 5 pods, the protective custody unit too. Big Rob Hutch was a man who had his ear to the ground. He had known the lockdown was imminent. He had just enough time to make preparations for what was coming. Happy for a chance to hang out and get fucked up. 7 of us quickly herded into his cell with our bedding, snacks from the commissary, as much gear as we can get our hands on. I remember that we were all wrapped up in our thin, scratchy blankets like convict burritos. The blankets were gray and made of rough wool. Upon checking into the razor wire inn, you were insured one and only one. In the winter, blankets were a premium. Men would fight for them, sometimes, even kill for them. Mikey and Big Rob were both sitting on the lower bunk. Coltrane and his kid Remy had the top one. I was freezing my ass on the floor along with Nick and Richie. Young pups had to sit on the floor. It's just the way it was. The old cons got to snuggle their asses into the relative comfort of thin mattresses, the ones that were covered with the squishy spring slats, and in Coltrane's case, the old con's bitch as well. We weren't complaining out loud about it, though. We knew better than to do that. Big Rob was a trustee, and one of his duties was to mop the floors in the prison morgue. He was telling us what had happened when the coroner performed his autopsy on Stutters. Stutters was a junkie who had been suspected of ratting out various other cons to the cops in exchange for smack. He was the reason why the entire pen was on lockdown. He'd been discovered in his bunk after lunch, dead as a day-old dog shit, half full of ragged holes. The shiv was found in a toilet in the shower room. It had been made from plastic bags, heated to melting with a bic, then compressed to form a sturdy, sharp little weapon. So I'm mopping up where they keep the gurneys, and down by the hall the door opens a bit so I can see the doc leaning over Stutters on the table. He's humming and singing to himself like usual. I'm smiling at how shitty his voice is when all of a sudden the doc says, "Holy shit, did you look at that?" Then he starts gagging and retching, and then get this. He's actually screams, like for real. He fucking screamed. And he yells, "Jesus Christ, it's all over my fucking arm." Runs out of the room. Down the other hall, I'm like, what the fuck was all that about, right? I hear him yelling for his assistant, or whoever, the younger one. They all come running back. I heard one of the assistants say, "Oh fuck, you gotta be kidding me." Then the smell hits me. And from all the way down that long-ass hallway, it's putrid, boys. It smelled like a combination of rotting flesh and the old shithouse in August. Had to grab my nose and run the fuck out of there. Worst thing I ever smelled. Nick asked, "What was it from?" And shifted uncontrollably where he sat beside the toilet. He was a good bit younger than me. He had just celebrated his 20th birthday a few months ago. It was his first time in. He'd drawn the fucking short straw, 15 years. 8 before he'd be considered for parole. His uncle, unfortunately for Nick, was also serving time in the same facility. He was an upper echelon, Hell's Angel, one who ruled both B-Pod and C-Pod with an iron fist. As a result, Nick was getting the easiest ride a first-timer in the pen ever had. Coltrane and Mikey had personally welcomed the kid into the crew, as per the old man's orders. He was fresh-faced, physically soft. I occasionally wondered if he'd ever really known just how bad it could have been here for him. "Apparently," Big Rob said, lowering his voice to a husky stage whisper, "Stutters was getting checked for pokes and track marks pretty regularly because he got busted so much for possession. So he started shooting it in his ass. But not like his ass cheek, you dig? I mean, right in the wall of his rectum. He was shooting it right inside his fucking ass, man. Can you imagine that? Pretty soon he developed a fucking horrible abscess. Because of all the fecal bacteria and the crap that was living up his old dirt road, the abscess got infected real bad. After a while, it skinned over with a crust of white blood cells and gross stuff. It ballooned out this giant bubble. Bubble got so big, it was eventually closed up the poor fucker's ass. I mean, right fucking shut. He was apparently going around like that for like weeks, man. Like, for real. Weeks. It must have hurt like a bitch. So, Doc saw something kind of bubbling out of the dead fucker's ass, prodded it with his scalpel, and pop. Out gushes a metric fuck ton of bloody green pus, full of dead bacteria stinking like the devil's back. Out gushes a metric fuckload of bloody green pus, full of dead bacteria and stinking like the devil's ballsack. Oh, fuck, that's just dirty, man. Mikey groaned, and Mime throwing up all over Hutch. We were all wrinkling our noses in disgust and shaking our heads. Dirty was not nearly adequate for this disgusting image. That ain't it, though, my friend. That ain't it. The worst part, he continued, was the fact that Stutters had been bunged up with his fucking balloon for weeks, so, stopped up his shit canal. So when the doc popped that thing with a scalpel, oh, hell, it was a literal shitstorm. Spurted out of him like a high-pressure hose. He regarded that image for a moment or two in stunned silence. I felt a bit ill. So fucking dirty, Mikey roared. And despite what I just heard, I had to laugh. Coltrane and the others joined in. Remy just looked disgusted. He was filing his nails. Remy was no longer just another cell block punk, a weaker man that traded what he had to trade in order to get by in a world dominated by strength. After a year or so of enduring the subservient role at the receiving end of Coltrane, he'd finally stopped playing the part and was now living it. It was apparent that he started living it again. So the doc got shit on by a corpse? Said Richie, in a slow and dreamy tone. And it was pus-covered shit. It's fucked up, man. Hey, do you think that happens a lot to him? Or was that the first time? Richie had snorted some hydromorphine earlier, and now he was somewhere in the clouds, floating around with a stoned grin on his face. Richie, that's just fucking... Mikey trailed off. Actually, it's a good question. Want some hooch, boys? I was just opening my mouth to say fuck no when there was a pop, and everything was dark. The cons began yelling and hooting all across the pod, both tiers on both sides. Big Rob yelled, "Shut up, will you fucking idiots? It's a blackout, for Christ's sake. Pipe the fuck down." And for a wonder, some of them actually did. Thing was, Big Rob Hutch was, well, just that. Big. He was as big as a buffalo. I was surprised that the lower bunk could support both Rob and Mikey, who was not exactly small himself. The emergency light snapped on, soft and red and eerie, and made the common area of C-Pod look like a scene from an apocalyptic horror movie. We could see the guard standing there in the guard hut through the bulletproof glass, waiting to see how the cons were going to react to the power going out during a lockdown. Now, not only were we sequestered in our cramped little cells for an undeterminate length of time, we had also been rendered unable to properly read a book. A number of cons could actually read, and did, or see your hand while playing cards, or even listen to the radio, for Christ's sake. The hack was a dark figure swathed in dim red, his body language alert and poised for action. Pretty sure it was Robson who was the boss on hut duty for that night. Robson was a dead-eyed, square-jawed oaf without an ounce of empathy in his whole body. He just so happened to have a 12-gauge shotgun on hand with a modified choke. I fervently hoped that no one would take it in their heads to start some serious shit, because if they did, there was a good chance we'd all regret it. There was a lot of hollering and door-kicking around the pod, but it soon became apparent that the ruckus was just for show, and was half-hearted at best. We all silently thanked whoever might be listening that the emergency reaction team wasn't going to be called in. The ERT didn't fuck around. Kevlar-suited, anonymous in their visored helmets, they'd march into the pod and indiscriminately barge into cell after cell, busting heads, whopping out teeth with their batons. Hell, Might even get shot in the ERT shoot to kill. Richie broke the silence. Man, I was getting real worried there for a minute. If the fucking goon squad busted in here, found all our shit, we'd be dicked. Richie was doing 6 years for selling pills. The sentence of a second-time loser. Oxycontin and hydrocodone were his chemical of choice. Faced with the boredom of prison life, he'd started using the product he sold. He was a straight-up junkie by Christmas of that year. Mikey didn't care about anyone using junk. Would even have a little snort here and there himself. But he didn't like addicts. Not one bit. He got Richie out of the crew. Addled by junk, plagued by debt, weak and alone, Richie ended up bunking with some fella from the top tier across from us. The black tier. In a maximum security penitentiary, this was unpleasant connotations. Richie ended up bunking with some fellas from the top tier across from us. Jesus. Felt horrible for how that ended for Richie. Still do. His desperate last bid to cling to his wretched moral existence only prolonged the inevitable. He was dead within a month. One day after enduring his mourning, oh God. I'm rambling now, aren't I? Sorry, I do that sometimes. Just have to bear with me. I guess I'm not so good at this, not like Mikey or Hutch. The lonely guy who can't sleep some nights when the shrieking wind could have been mistaken for wailing of lost souls. Shaking, rattling the windows in their frames. Even though I was released from the pen 15 years ago, I still can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow still inside. Just, we're all imprisoned by something, on some level, aren't we? On nights like tonight, my prison is the rusty trailer. My pathetic, menial job. My divorce. My raw, red-eyed fury, unfocused and impotent. Sorrow. Regret. On nights like tonight, my prison is the past. My inability to leave it behind. So there we all were, sitting there in the weird red gloom and listening to all the yelling and bullshit slowly die down. Richie abruptly went on the nod. Nick balanced a shoe on his head. We all chuckled. Coltrane started talking about the hockey game that was about to start. Then abruptly shut up. We were in a lockdown. No electricity. There'd be no hockey game that night, not for us. We passed a J around. When that one was roached, we passed another. Finally, Mikey spoke up and broke the silence. So, who's up for some Twilight Zone shit tonight? I got a good one for you. Remember the last time the power went out, Hutch? Hutch shot him a dark look, then did something very unusual for a hardened con. He shuddered. You want to tell the boys that story? I don't know, man. Why not? Fuck, the lights are out. The winds are howling out there. Perfect time for it. Okay, fuck it. Let's do this. Big Rob cleared his throat and said, Okay, boys. It's time for a scary story. Crowd around the fucking campfire and grab a cup of the fine wine. It's more of a brandy, I think, Hutch. Mikey grinned and offered me some. Reluctantly, I accepted a styrofoam cup of the murky, eye-watering stuff and steered myself to swallow it. I was feeling a bit happier now. Always been a fan of spooky stories. His voice stern, Mikey growled, Okay, first things first. This shit is 100% true, got it? We're not bullshitting about any of this, for real. So don't tell us that we're all full of shit, or you can go have a fucking sleepover with that asshole over at the Hackin' Shack. Got it, Richie groaned, and flopped over onto the floor. He was out of it. This all went down a long time ago, before any of you were here. At least 12 years, I'd say. Mikey? Yeah, for sure. At least that long. Back when these little punks were still giving out hand jobs in juvie. It was a while back anyway. Me and Mikey were both running with different crews back then and different shit. We knew each other. Guess I would have been about your age, he said, pointing down at me. So one day the fish tank had just been emptied out in the pond, right? There's new fish with him. It immediately starts turning heads. I was playing checkers on the tier upstairs. They all came walking through the gate looking like a bunch of lost little lambs down there on the range. Him toddling in behind a couple of the hacks. And the end of the line, he's the prettiest little sweet boy this whole penitentiary had ever seen. I don't play no grab ass like Coltrane up there. This guy, he was, I don't know, an angel or something, you know, too perfect. Picture out of a magazine, you know, slender, fair-haired, heartthrob material. This kid is pretty, all right. Looked like he'd be easy to punk. Big Rob took a moment to pause and force back a swig of the awful, cloying Pruno, a noxious blend of fermented fruit, sugar packets, and yeast. As he grimly swallowed it down, Mikey jumped in and continued the story. New fish immediately drove the whole pod completely fucking nuts. The wolves were losing their mind for real. The guards, they were looking worried. A guy like that can cause a lot of hard feelings between the bulls. Hard feelings usually turn into murder. So they released the other fishies into the care of the boss of the guard hut. Then, they hustled the pretty boy off to a protective custody, post-fucking haste. Kept him there for a few days. The wolves didn't forget about him, though. Not for a moment. All the time they're asking about this guy to the trustees who had access to PC. They're asking if the kid's lonely, if he wants a candy bar, or a fuck book, or a baggie of fucking horse, or whatever. They're handing the trustee love notes to give to him, money, weed, all kinds of shit. Finally, con named Holbrook called in some heavy favors. The hacks moved the kid back into the pod, more to the point, to Holbrook's cell. I remember watching as the hacks walked the young fella across the pod up the stairs to his new home. Kid had no expression on those wide blue eyes, none at all, just blank. The Holbrook was a big, greasy son of a bitch. Real nasty. You could smell him from 20 feet away. Complete psycho, that guy. Man, I'll tell you. The way his brookie grinned and waited at the door of his cell for his new little bunk buddy to arrive, hell, it made me feel sorry for the kid. He was planning to do bad things to the guy, and you could see it in his grin. He's gonna hurt him. No expression at all on the guy's face when he shows up. I remember thinking that the fishies were rather brave as fuck, just too stupid to understand what was in store for him. Rob tossed back the rest of the hooch in his Dixie cup and tried not to gag. Shit's fucking awful. Who brewed this? Our fine neighbors down the hall, that's who. They managed to hide it in the toilet tank long enough to get her finished. Now, holy Jesus, it ain't nasty. Fuck. I feel myself going blind already. Hutch held out his cup and Mikey poured him another gurt out of the plastic bag, taking care to make sure the sock he was using as a filter didn't slip and spilling a rotting fruit cocktail all over the bunk. I tried a sip of mine and almost retched. They all had a good hearty har at this, except for Richie, I guess. Richie was still laying on the floor, his eyelids fluttering and twitching. It broke more than a few hearts to see Holbrook get his dirty hooks in the kid first. He'd wrecked that kid, destroy his soul. That was the general consensus. Come morning, they'd be rolling the kid into the infirmary and afterwards probably stick him back in PC for 24 hours. Even if he did come back to the pod again, no one would want him. Not after the permanent damage that Brookie was liable to do to him. See how lucky you are? Coltrane said to Remy, and his little Frenchman smiled down at his nails in response, then kept filing them, delicately, with all of his concentration. Every now and then I wondered if Remy was already planning the flirtations and indiscretions that would inevitably result in Coltrane's murder. His skull smashed in with 20-pound dumbbell in the weight pit. Coltrane, the bull, who had taken Remy's manhood and eventually transformed him into something that he'd probably never wanted to be. Thinking about it now, I'm pretty sure he was. I can't blame him for it. Rob told us. I heard screaming that night, muffled. But I could hear it. So did my cellie back then, old Johnny Finisi. Whispered up to him, "You hear that shit, man? Fuck, that's awful." It was one of the worst nights here. I heard it too, Mikey interjected. I think we all did, including the bosses on duty that night. No one wanted to check on him because money makes the fucking rules around here, not the warden or the government. It's money. I don't doubt that sick fuck offering big coin for the kid. Some cold son of a bitch sold him without a second thought. Hutch nodded sourly. Money's a whore. That's okay, though. There's a thing called karma, too, and when the morning came, lo and behold, Brookie ain't standing outside of his cell, waiting to be accounted for, and neither's the kid. Whisper popped up real quick, spreading down the lines like a breeze. It said Holbrook went ape shit on the kid last night, killed him. He waited in his cell for the ERT to come in and bust his head. The boss, doing the head count, paused at Holbrook's cell. Every con craned his head to see what was going on, what was going to happen next. All of us in unison. I seen the hack pull out his radio with one hand and his club with the other. He starts talking real fast into his radio, right? At the same time, slowly walking towards the door of Brookie's cell with his club poised to bash a skull in like he's trying to ward someone off. Starts yelling for their hacks to get the fuck over there pronto. They all came thundering past with their keys jangling, their boots clomping, and we all got ordered to step back into our cells with empty bellies. I heard him down there at Brookie's cell yelling into their radios, stomping around, then I hear someone barf. He had the puke splatter on the tiles. We had to stay in our cells for a few hours, and there was a lot of bitching. I mean, I remember just being totally, completely pissed at Holbrook, me and Johnny F. We assumed that he'd gone psycho on the new fish, cut the kid's throat while he was fucking him or some shit like that. But then some of the emergency response guys come wheeling past this gurney. And when they wheeled it past us again, you could have knocked me flat with a pea shooter. It was Holbrook strapped in there, not the kid. I only saw him for a few seconds. I remember his face was fucked, mostly gone. Stripped right down to bloody sinew and bone, no skin or muscle left. It's fucking gruesome. Kind of gasped out loud, even closed mouth. Crooked nose old Johnny F had to look twice and say, what the fuck? The only way I knew it was him was the hair. Big greasy mop of it like a caveman. The sheet covered the body. It was soaked right through with his blood. I think the rest of him must have matched his face. Nick whistled and said, fuck, man, that's hardcore. Then sparked another joint. We floor dwellers had almost forgotten about the discomfort of our numb behinds and tingling feet. We'd forgotten the lockdown and the power outage and even poor Stutters, who not only died a violent death, but had died with his ass blocked up by a cystic sore the size of a human fist. Mikey and Hutch were telling a story, and we were living it. You know what I mean? You were right there. Mikey said, it must have been 5 minutes later, the cops are rolling this crazy-looking thing down the block, and I'm like, what the fuck is that, to my cellie? He doesn't know either. For too long, they roll it past again, and I'm like, oh shit, look at this. You ever see Silence of the Lambs? The dolly cart thing they strap Anthony Hopkins to when they're moving him. Yeah, that's what it is. And they've got the kid strapped to it. Bite mask and everything. Kid's just soaked in blood. Man, it was dripping off his clothes. I could hear it spattering on the floor behind him. Left a trail on the floor. They let us out for breakfast about a half hour after that, but then it was almost lunch. We got served the fucked up mix of warm lunch, cold breakfast. There was more talking going on than eating, though. Everyone was saying the same thing we were all saying. What the fuck did that kid do to him? Most people thought he must have gotten a hold of Brookie's shiv somehow, then sliced the fucker right off. Whittled him right down to the bone. But Brookie was a really big dude. Guy was a crazy motherfucker. How was a skinny little bitch like that overpower a bad dude like Brookie so easy? I mean, we don't know. The joint traveled around the floor folk and was then handed up the bunks. Mikey hit it hard and made that funny choking noise older guys sometimes do when they hold a big toke, nasal and strangled. He gave Nicky the thumbs up and blasted out smoke like a grizzled old dragon. It's pretty good, Nicky. Good score. Gotta get some more of that. Yeah, kid. He got rolled off the hole in his fucking Hannibal Lecter dolly, and they had him in a super tight lockdown. Nobody even catches a glimpse of him. Had the kid on 24-hour watch. The whole works. A couple trustees tried along with the hacks, asked what happened to him and Brookie, and they got told to mind their own business. Mop the fucking floors. The kid in the hole for a week, then 2, then, I don't know, month, All the while, ain't no one heard a peep out of him getting charged with murder. There was a rumor going around that the coroner said in his report that Holbrook had died from a heart attack. Maybe his heart seizing up was the thing that actually killed him, but sure. There wasn't any mention of what we'd seen carved up like a Sunday turkey, not at all. Mikey poured himself another round of refreshment, and the stink of the open bag made my eyes water. Hutch smiled a little, an action with no real humor behind it. Well, tongue's gonna waggle, as they tend to do. Pretty soon people were saying that maybe the kid wasn't natural. He did Brookie in with his teeth. He ate the fucker alive, like some sort of monster. Guys were even saying that the priest paid him a visit in the hole, ended up leaving with tears in his eyes. Actual fucking crying and shit. Couldn't say what happened. Just that he didn't want to talk to the kid never again. He quit. He quit working here not long after that happened. Just up and quit. And I heard that Padre ended up selling his house and moving away. Like, across the country. Somewhere far, far away. Mikey's iron gray beard split with a slight grin of his own. Now, here is where shit gets really weird. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm just going to give you a quick warning that I never really do on any of my stories, but it felt appropriate here. This story deals a lot with prison life, and as prison life goes, there's quite a few things I don't normally touch on, like very gross situations and sexual violence. So, listener discretion advised. And now, on to tonight's story. Big Rob grunted, Billy Tremont, and then hauled hard on the joint, decimating it to a smoldering ember between his thick fingers. Yeah, him. Billy Tremont. He was a hack who worked the night shift. And I tell you something, he was just as dirty as they come. Fucking guy wasn't just on the take, he was the take. You know what I'm saying? He was as much a gangster as any of the boys in here. He controlled what came into the pen, and when, and who got it, how much they got. The dude squeezed out whatever competition he had from the other cops, the ones who were playing the game, by any means available. He set him up to get fired, paid to have him shit kicked by the bikers, you name it. He was a complete fucking asshole, but he was also real good at getting you what you wanted, for a price. Well, it's a fact that people love a mystery, especially people who ain't got a fuck all to do with their time. A few people pulled together some cash, and they came to Billy, because if anyone could find the answers to their questions, Billy Tremont could. Billy laughed, tell him that he'd love to take their money, but he couldn't do what they were asking. Says that the weird little bastard didn't have no file, as far as I can tell. Don't know who he was, why he came here, or where he came from. No one does, and that's the goddamn truth. The guys called him a bullshitter, and Billy got serious on them. He narrowed his eyes, said to him, "You guys don't think I tried to find out for myself already?" Far as I can tell, the kid just sort of popped up into the fish tank out of thin air. It looks to me like everyone just kept processing him along, because no one wanted to admit that they didn't know who the fuck the kid was. Call me a liar again, I'll beat the fear of God into you. It was clear that they weren't going to get anywhere with Billy, so the guys, "What kid? Wait a minute, man. Which one's the kid?" Richie's eyes looked like black bottomless pools. I remember that. He'd always sunk deep into the mindless tar pit of addiction by then. He was past a point of no return. You could see it in his eyes. "Shut up, dummy." Rob turned to Mikey and made a gesture that said, "Please continue." Mikey gave Rich a cold stare and said, "So the guys give up and said, fuck it then. And that's that for a while. Life goes on. Then comes a day when Billy saddles up to one of the cons while he's sitting in the morning chow line and tells him he's found some information on the fish, if anyone still cared to know. Billy was looking bad, they say. Looked tired. Looked scared. That night, Billy comes to see the guy in his cell after lights out. He asks the guys for a smoke. Billy had quit smoking years ago. Billy says to him, I don't want any money for this. Keep your lousy fucking money. I don't want to be the one that can't sleep at night is all. You pieces of shit got him into my head. I couldn't get him out. Fuck you for doing that. Fuck you people sideways. The guy said Billy Tremone's hands were shaking. So fucking bad he couldn't hardly get his smoke lit. No, Billy tells the con, the curiosity had been eating him fucking alive. So he spent some time thinking on how to go about getting what he wanted. And then picked his mark. Billy always had his ear to the ground, you know the type. He knew this and that. He did what and where and why. He knew stuff about people. He knew that one of the suits in the office had a bad coke habit, kind of raging habit that most people can't afford for long. He also knew that the suit and the warden were both banging the same chick, warden's secretary. Now Billy gave him a 1/4 ounce of good rock cocaine, told him what he wanted. Promised to shoot the guy an 8-ball on top of what he'd already given him, if the guy could deliver the goods. Well, so he came back to him a few days later with the sniffles and a file folder that looked older than the Bible. It was made out of some rough, crumpled old cardboard, dry as dust. The office stiff says the warden's secretary told him where to find it, locked up in a cabinet in the warden's office. Said he'd put himself in all kinds of dangers to get it. And he wanted more than a ball for his troubles. He wanted more than a 1/4, too. Billy told him that he could either take the ball or Billy could let the warden know that one of his minions wasn't just a cokehead and a thief, but he was dipping his wick into the warden's honeypot, too. The Billy told the suit that the ass fucking the warden would give him wouldn't be anywhere near as bad as the one the wolves would deliver. The guy shut his yap, took his 8-ball, parted ways. So in between drags of his smoke, Billy tells the con that the first documents in the folder were pages taken from a court transcript. Some backwater courthouse sitting way out in cow country. They were handwritten with an old-time pen. Billy says, you know, the kind you had to dip in a fucking inkwell, then pat dry against a blotter so the shit didn't smear. That's how old this thing was. All the dates, the kids' names, they're all scribbled out, Billy said. But he figured that the first documents in the folder were from the late 1800s. Nick snorted. That ain't fucking possible. Mikey shrugged. Is what it is, Nicky. Transcript said the kid had been charged with multiple murder, practicing satanic rituals, cannibalism, arson, mayhem. He was only 16 years old when they tried him. The prosecutor wanted to hang him for his crimes, but the defense lawyer that the Crown had appointed was some greasy little fucker. He argued that it would be godly to let the kid live out the rest of his days in jail, seeing as how the kid was known to be an orphan vagrant who raised himself in the woods. No more guidance in the woods. That was the argument. The jury ended up getting all pious. And they commuted the kid's date with a rope to a life sentence. They shipped him off to the clink, and that very night, killed his cellmate. He killed him with his nails and teeth, and then he ate the poor son of a bitch. Coltrane looked disturbed. Holy fuck. A horror movie. Sorry, you guys have gotta be shitting us. Mikey shrugged again. I kinda wish I was. But no, I'm not. Not according to Billy Tremont anyway. Billy said they stuck the kid in a loony bin for the criminally insane after he ate his cellie. Put him in a straitjacket. At some point, quacks realized that the usual treatment wasn't going to work for shit, so they decided to give the kid a lobotomy. He was out like a light from the ether. They were just getting ready to start The kid suddenly breaks his arm restraints and sinks his teeth into the lead surgeon's throat like a goddamn wolf, ripped it right out. There's no way that he should have still been conscious, let alone being able to snap those thick bands of leather. But he was. And he did. The way I heard it, Hutch said, after he killed the quack, they put the kid back on the stand. This time, he got 12 votes for death. Took him to the town square, marched the kid up to the gallows, with the townspeople screaming, throwing moldy bread and cow shit at him. He was laughing at him. Hangman put the rope around his neck, asked the kid if he had any last repentant words to share with the crowd. Kid says loud and clear, "There's nothing to repent in doing what you want. I'd fuck your mother and fry up her heart if I wanted to. And after I was done picking my teeth, I wouldn't so much as fart her a blessing. Why should I?" So the cops beat on the kid with the clubs a bit, put the hood on the little fucker, and the hangman pulls the lever. But the trap door won't open. Don't know what to do. All the while, kids laughing and cursing at him, praising the devil, being a general pain in the ass. People were screaming for him to swing. It was getting ugly out there and fast, so someone gets the bright idea they could just put the kid up against a wall and shoot him and just be done with it. Only that didn't work either, Mikey added, his words becoming thick and slurred. Sounded like the hooch was starting to do his trick. They put the kid up against the brick wall. 5 cops took aim. 5 cops pulled the trigger. 5 guns misfire. They try again. Same shit happened again. By now the people watching were getting spooked. A crowd of farmers and mill workers who came out to watch the kid hang. They all suddenly had places to go. People left. The Lord's Prayer was on more than a few set of lips as they went. When everyone was gone, the cops packed the kid back in the wagon because there was nothing else they could do. Took him back to the courthouse, and after some debating behind closed doors, the judge had him sent to a different jail. He was locked up in an unused room in the basement. Then they boarded the door. And then, for good measure, they bricked the whole thing over. Richie attempted to focus his eyes up at Mikey and ask, Can they really do that, man? We just put someone in a hole, brick the fucker over? Nick spoke up. His voice was hoarse. Maybe not these days, but he's talking about, back when a lot of people didn't have a birth certificate, so they could have done that. I mean, who'd ever know? He lit another joint and passed it. So what, man? They just let the crazy little fucker there to die? Richie appeared to be in the grip of a dubious species of moral outrage. Another good question, Richie. Maybe you haven't killed every single brain cell yet after all. Nicky slugged back some more of the noxious hooch and grimaced. Billy Tremont said that there was only 2 other documents in the folder. An extremely fucking old mugshot and a report to the Board of Corrections from a sanitation engineer. It was written sometime in the 50s. He'd been down in the old basement of that very same prison where they walled up the kid. He was down there checking out the shit pipes. Didn't have fuck all to do with what he was looking for, but the engineer mentioned in his report he'd found a bricked over doorway down there. Curiosity got the better of him. He tore away the crumbling old bricks with a crowbar, pried the boards off, popped the door open. And you know what he found? A skeleton, Richie muttered. He was struggling to keep his eyes from sliding shut. No, nothing. That's what he found. When he forced the door open, the room was empty. We all took a few moments to digest this. And then Bulldog ate his gun. Don't forget about that. Hutch rumbled. He handed the J back over to Nicky. Nick curled his lips in disgust. Who slobbered on this shit? He demanded. It's wet as fuck. It's gross, man. Fucking gross. No one owned up to the deed. Nick started to bitch about it some more, and Hutch gave him that look, the one that said, shut up immediately or regret it. Nick shut up. Mikey snickered. Thank you kindly, Hutch. And Nikki, come on, kiddo, just pinch off the wet parts, stop your bitching. Anyhow, that fucking prick Bulldog, right. He was one of the least loved hacks in the entire history of this joint. A real, genuine, dyed-in-the-wool piece of shit. He was still a few years south of retiring when this all happened. Late 50s, I'd say. A huge, fat, red-faced motherfucker. Meaner than fuck. His blood pressure was right off the scale all the time. There wasn't nothing he liked better than to find an excuse to smash some unfortunate bastard upside the head. He'd do it with a sock full of quarters that he kept hanging on his belt. When you heard the jingling of the change, you straightened up, you stopped fucking around till it was gone. If that nasty old fuck was in a mood, you steered clear and you kept your big yap shut. So they put this fucking guy on watch in front of the kid's cell. Doing the graveyard shit, right? He was all alone too, no partner, nothing. Guess the other hacks didn't like the fat mouthy fuck either way. There he was, night after night, just him and this creepy little kid all night long. Normally, this wouldn't have been very good for the con being watched, being alone with a tired, grumpy bulldog, no witnesses. It would have been a long, long season in hell for most cons. But the fish wasn't the usual white boy dummy we get in here, you know. Like a kid who got mixed up with something stupid, wasn't rich enough to buy his way out of it. Not this fish. He was something else entirely. Mikey paused and forced down a big gulp of Pruno. Hutch jumped in. Well, old Bulldog only lasted for about a month before he got his shift supervisor and requested he be taken off the watch. The head screws office door was open a bit. Some dude named Tags or Rags or some shit I can't remember. Anyway, he supposedly overheard most of the conversation while he was waiting to see the warden. Why was he waiting to see the warden? Richie mumbled. As per usual, Richie wasn't really getting the main focus of the story. Fucking ratting on someone, right? Fucking goof. Eat those fuckers. Rat needs to get hurt, bro. Fucking rat needs to get... Jesus, Richie, go on the nod or something, wouldn't you? You're a waste of skin. Hutch looked dangerously displeased. Richie grinned a big, goofy grin and whispered, Fucking rats, though. Hutch frowned at him thunderously, then continued. So, Tags or Rags or whatever hears Bulldog say that he wants off the watch. Boss asks him why. He won't say, just that he's tired, doesn't like watching the kid. Boss asks if he wants a partner. Bulldog says no, just wants off the goddamn watch and that's it. So, head screw huffs, puffs, blows him off. Gives Bulldog some shitty speech about not wanting to abruptly change everyone's schedule for one fucking guy. And how he did do that. Little Johnny wouldn't see his daddy up in the fucking stands at his next ball game and it'd fuck him up for life, you know, guilting the fat prick and that sort of thing, you know. And then he tells Bulldog no, sends him on his way. Bulldog went home, drank most of a bottle of whiskey. Then stuck his service pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Nicky Roach, the allegedly slobbered-on joint, blew out a tremendous lungful of smoke. There was no way the smell of the dank wasn't rolling through the whole goddamn pod by then, but none of us were concerned about it. If everyone was behaving themselves, the COs would leave us to our vices in peace. The situation was volatile enough already. Mikey piped up and said, That's a sad fucking thing, you know? When one of us string ourselves up or a guy gets his hands on a razor blade, no one gives a fuck. Hacks laugh at you because our bowels let go and you fucking shit yourself when you die. That's your obituary, right? Life goes on, no one gives a second thought. But this asshole sticks a gun in his yapper, blows his brains out the top of his head, and hell, suddenly he's a hero. There's even a big article in the local paper about how the stress of being on a correction officer causes depression. And blah, 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 blah. Sensitive souls can't handle the gritty reality of working with drugged out ass-fuck convicts. It's kind of laughable, really. You know, whoever wrote that article didn't know Bulldog personally, that's for sure. Hutch interjected. But the fucking newspaper didn't mention nothing about what actually drove the piggy to blow his head off. And fuck no. No mention of the kid at all. Kid was the warden's nasty little secret, because they didn't know who the fuck the kid was or where he came from, and one way or another, the creepy little bastard was making people dead. All they had to go on was an old court document that read like a horror book. Passing mention of a sanitation report. A black and white picture of someone who looked like the kid. Couldn't possibly be the kid. I was suddenly aware I was getting a bit freaked out. In the soft red gloom stoned out of my tree, every word that Mikey and Hutch uttered seemed frighteningly plausible. I cleared my throat and announced, I gotta tell you guys, this is a fucked up story. Getting creeped out down here. Hutch blinked down at me with inebriated surprise. Shit, I forgot you even down there. Quiet little fucker, ain't he? More bubbly in your cup, my friend. Still hadn't managed to finish my first helping of the vile stuff. I shook my head and finished Nikki's doobie instead. Mikey lapsed into silence. We were silent with him. In the silence, something dawned on me. I said, "Hey, Mikey, when they brought the kid to a different jail and walled him up, after they couldn't execute him, that was this place, wasn't it? When you guys first saw him, he wasn't a new fish at all. The kid was the oldest con in the entire joint." "That one's pretty smart, Mikey," Hutch said. "Compared to Richie, he's a fucking scholar. Should make him our treasurer or something. What do you think?" "We ain't got nothing to treasure here, old man. Not this fucking shithole." Mikey poured himself another shot of the eye-watering concoction in the bag. "But yeah, you got her, buddy. According to Billy Tremont, it was right underneath this very building." He let out a raspy sigh and hoisted aloft his Dixie cup of hooch. "To Billy Tremont," he said. "I sincerely hope God took it easy on you." "How'd he die?" Nicky asked, and Mike flashed that humorless smile again. "Not long after Bulldog ate some lead. He woke up to the sound of a gunshot in the middle of the night again. They found Billy Tremont dead on the CO's locker room. His brains and bits of his skull were sliding down the wall beside his body like snails. The coroner declared that it was another suicide, but here's the thing. They found 5 chunks of lead embedded in the wall, all at chest height, and one in his brain. There was a full cup of coffee spilled on the floor beside him, but he still had a vacation request form clutched in his free hand. Mikey leaned back against the wall and let out a scornful gust of air. "So according to the official report, here's Billy sipping on a fresh cup of coffee about to go to the office, request some vacation time, and suddenly, right there and then, with no warning or reason, decides to shoot himself. Before he does that, he fires all the bullets in his service pistol into the wall, except for the one he fires through his own temple. Now, that's an odd way to go, don't you think?" Nick looked disturbed. "The kid came for him. That's what happened, isn't it?" He appeared very young and very vulnerable in the dim crimson light, his face unlined and guiltless. "It got out of its cell and he was coming for him. The cop tried to shoot it, then turned the gun on himself before it could, get him." "Can't say for sure, Nicky. The only guy who can is 13 years in his grave." Remy tentatively cleared his throat from his top bunk. "You said something to Hutch about the power going out before. Something that happened when it did. What were you talking about?" "Nah, maybe we shouldn't get into that tonight." "Hell, might as well tell him the rest," Hutch rumbled. "Gone this far, haven't we?" A week after Billy bit the dust, a storm rolled in, knocked the power out. Clear across all county. We all heard it into our cells, told to shut up, fucking behave. A lot of the hacks couldn't make it into work that night on account of roads being fucked up with accidents, torrential rain, all that shit. So the bosses who did make it to work were all carrying heavy firepower. Made it clear they weren't gonna fuck around if somebody got out of hand. Now, right around midnight, I hear a shotgun go off somewhere on the other side of the pen. Can't mistake that sound, if you're familiar to it. I was wide awake on my feet in a heartbeat. Sort of muffled, far away, I hear screaming. There was a boss standing nearby in my cell, and over his radio a voice was squawking, "He's out! He's out of his cell! He killed Amesley! He's ripping everyone apart! Get your asses over to solitary now!" Hack took off running. I turned over to Johnny Francini. He stole the words right out of my mouth. He says, "The boy, he's loose. This is bad." It was dark in there, but I'm pretty sure I saw Johnny cross himself. Mikey's eyes glittered at us in the semi-darkness, glassy from the drink and wide from the memory on his lips. There was a second gunshot, and then a whole lot more. They echoed and they boomed and they scared us shitless. When they tapered off and we heard more screaming, it sounded like animals at a slaughterhouse, squealing, buck wild, and they breathed their last. Now, me and my silly, we fucking hid in the corner with a mattress in front of us. We didn't know what was happening. Just the hacks tried to shoot something, and they didn't fucking succeed. I'm not afraid to admit it. I was shitting my pants. I heard feet come slapping across the cement, then 3 hacks sprinted past our cell. Hutch said. They weren't just running, they were fucking sprinting, hauling ass like Olympians. I seen their faces for a second. They were wild with fear. I've never seen anyone look like that, before or since. Everyone was hollering at him as they passed, asking him what the fuck was going on. They didn't answer. They didn't even hear us. They just ran on by and kept going. After a few minutes, a 4th guy comes along. He's limping real bad. He's using his rifle as a crutch. He got left behind, I guess. Hack looks looking over his shoulder and a lot of sort of jog hopping as fast as he could manage. He's leaving a trail of blood behind him. Hack's uniform was shredded and torn on one side of his body, flapping around like rags, and I yell at him, "Hey, what the fuck happened to you guys? What's going on?" And he stopped in front of the cell, right? You see the guy a little better now. I wished I hadn't. It was Amesley. He wasn't dead. At least, not yet. His right arm had been shredded to almost nothing. It was just a few flapping pieces of meat. Stringy shit, oozing blood, barely holding the bones together, right? His right thigh was missing huge chunks of meat, too. Most of the foot. Guy's face was gray from blood loss. His eyes were like dolls, like 2 pieces of round, murky glass, right? He was in shock. Moved his mouth trying to find some words and said, "I think I'm dying." Then he started hopping again. There was puddles of blood on the floor where he stopped. "Okay, that's enough," Remy said, and his voice quivered a little. I don't hear any more." "I don't remember asking if you did," like you asked. Remy pursed his painted lips and went silent. Hutch continued. "I heard something else coming then. Something running on all fours, something with claws. I backed up against the wall as far as I could go, and Johnny cowered down to his bunk, his blanket pulled up around his face. Came in fast and ripped past my cell like a fucking blur of arms and legs. About 10 seconds later, I heard Amesley start wailing like a siren. It was awful. They were death screams, man. Nothing else could force a living creature to let out such a awful fucking sound. It took me a moment to understand that Amesley wasn't just screaming. He was saying something. He was saying, "Mommy, it's eating me! Mommy, it's eating me!" And then I remember I was screaming right along with him. So was Johnny. The whole pod was screaming, You remember that, Mikey? All of us, 200 murderers, stick-up men, fucking screaming in unison like little girls. I won't ever forget that. Not ever, Mikey said, quietly. Hack finally stopped making noise. We all did. You could almost taste the terror in the air, right? Sharp and bitter. I could smell Amesley's blood. Coppery smell that gets in your throat makes you want to retch. So quiet. Silent as a tomb. You could heard a pin drop, then slowly, so slowly, a figure comes strolling into view on the range. kid. Red from head to toe, completely covered in blood. Guts, shreds of stuff that keep sliding off of him, dripping onto the floor. He wandered right down the middle of the range, and he was carrying Ainsley's head by the hair, dangling beside his leg as he walked. I watched him as he passed by. I didn't breathe. Not once did I even fucking dare to breathe. The kid ambles up to the hack shack, just as casual as can be. He puts Ainsley's severed head on the ledge of the window, and he walks out in the middle of the range. Raised his arms, pointed at all of us. I mean, each individual cell. Like he was marking us, each and every one. Marking us for death. When he was done, the kid walked back the way he came. Disappeared from view. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. He was just gone. There was a minute of silence. Finally, I spoke up. Why the fuck did I never hear about any of this before? I mean, how? This should have been everywhere. The news, TV crime shows, fucking everywhere. Nick chimed in and said, I never heard nothing about this either. I used to love those fucking crime shows. No, you never heard anything about that, but you might have heard something about a prison riot, Mikey said. According to the newspapers, the cons took advantage of the power outage, went apeshit for a few hours. Most of the guards on duty died trying to stop us, the story goes. The government funded a swell new electronic locking system, all because of what happened that night. I thought about that for a moment and then said, I don't know. What don't you know, huh? I'll fucking tell you the rest, how's that? Hutch glared down at me and his narrowed eyes slammed phantom punches into my face. They froze. The three hacks that we'd seen running for their lives, they ran right into the arms of the SWAT team, who'd just gotten on the scene with their guns drawn. The cops busted through the gate. They found what was left of Ainsley first, ignored our hollowing, and followed the blood trail. They found the rest of them in the hallway. The one that runs down the middle of Solitary, lying in a raw heap with blood congealing in a pool beneath the bodies like the gravy. All the cell doors had been ripped away from their hinges. The cons inside had been torn into pieces. From what I heard, it took a crime scene cleanup crew 6 days to clean out that wing. And even after that, the cons and the hacks, they were finding dried up bits of flesh and bone for months on end. We told you what happened. And you can believe it or not. I don't give a fuck. And neither does Mikey. And ask around if you want to. There's some long-timers here that might have been able to talk about it if you give them something to loosen their lips. And once again, I don't give a fuck. His whole pod had nightmares for a long, long time. I'm probably going to have them till the day I die. I doubt I'm the only one. There's something within these fucking walls. It looks human but isn't. It's something you don't want to meet, and believe me, you better hope you never do. Hutch stopped talking then. And as the hour was late, we were all pretty fucked. The silence soon turned to sleep. I recall dreaming of a fair-haired young man who stood amongst us as we slept. Silent as a shadow. His eyes completely black in the feeble glow of the emergency lights. His expression vulpine, hungry. I remember that in the dream I was very, very afraid that the boy would sense that I was not actually asleep. And if he discovered I was awake, he'd devour me. I remember this quite clearly. We awoke early in the morning to the pitiful sounds of a junk-sick Richie heaving into the toilet. The lights were back on, the lockdown was over. Richie wasn't the only one who was feeling like shit that morning. We were all in pretty rough shape, especially us floor folk. Sleeping in a sitting position on cold concrete makes for a stiff, painful morning. None of us had much to say. We all sat and smoked, waited for the hacks to do morning head count. I wondered if Pounding hangovers weren't the only reason for that. I suspected I wasn't the only one whose sleep had been disturbed by the fair-haired specter. Thing that should have ceased to walk the earth years before, but just hadn't. Thing with a terrible appetite. The cops finally came around and let us out of our cages. They pointedly did not perform the morning cell check. If they had, they simply wouldn't have had enough cells in solitary to confine all the rule breakers. We all were trooped off to stand in the chow line except Richie, who opted to stay behind and undoubtedly indulge in a snort or two. And that's pretty much where the story ends. Well, almost. I was released a year early for good behavior. During the rest of my time there, most of Mikey's crew was paroled, either through the front door or the back. Richie was the first one to get wheeled out the back way. Then 8 months later, Coltrane's skull was pounded into a new and messy format, and he followed Richie out the back door. 6 months later, before I was uncaged, Big Rob Hutch had a heart attack. He was walking upstairs that led to the tier above ours. He fell backwards, clutching his chest. He was dead before he somersaulted over the last few steps and landed at the bottom. So for a while, it was just me, Mikey, Nick, and a few casual homeboys. Got boring. The crew unraveled at the seams, and by the time I was paroled, it had ceased to exist. A few months after my divorce was finalized, I got nostalgic one night, and I decided to try and find Mikey online. Soon enough, I did, though it was through his obituary. He died in the hospital of a short illness, not long after I was released. Remy was also deceased, victim of a shower room stabbing. Nicky, I discovered he was in a mental institution. Yeah, I visited him there once. I'd rather be in jail any day. Most of the patients I saw there were zombies, chemically bitch-slapped into subservience by their meds. There were a few others who were just strange. Gaze made me feel unsafe, for Christ's sake. I did time in a federal penitentiary, I was shown to where Nicky sat by himself at a table, and he instantly recognized me. We greeted each other like old friends. Made small talk just like anyone would. He seemed completely normal to me. I didn't understand why he was in there until I mentioned Hutch. So what do you think happened to Hutch exactly? I asked him. And his relaxed grin suddenly became a twisted grimace of fear. He seized me by the front of my jacket, hauled me close. His eyes burned bright with fiery red intensity. He hissed. The kid pushed him down the stairs. It wasn't a fucking heart attack. That's the cover-up. The kid got Mikey too. It ate everything but his head. It left his head on his fucking pillow. The orderlies grabbed Nicky and pried him off of me, and they dragged him away while he screamed and flailed and twisted in their iron grip. I watched this with an open mouth, and my heart pounding. And then I went home, and I got very, very drunk. Somewhere within those prison walls, there's a thing that hungers. And sometimes it feeds. I don't expect you to believe this any more than I did, but you know what? On nights like this, with the wind howling and the fine hairs standing up on my neck, I couldn't care less what you believe. And if you were ever unfortunate enough to meet him face to face, I bet that kid wouldn't care what you believe either. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and thank you so much for watching tonight's video. And if you guys are not listening on the podcast, then I strongly suggest you check out Spotify. The MrCreepyPasta Storytime podcast on Spotify is exactly what you see here on YouTube. Or if you're listening on the podcast, I strongly suggest you check out YouTube. The MrCreepyPasta channel on YouTube is the exact same thing you see on Spotify. So really, there's no reason to cross-platform unless you just want to see more things. Or you want to see more of me, which you can also do on Twitter at MrCreepyPasta. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. That includes everybody who's been waiting for me to update my Patreon, and I thank you all so much for being so patient with me. But especially, I want to give a thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Jacob Fenske, Stephanie Butler, Bobby Carmen, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Tristan Pelton, Acid System, Adam Garrick, Aaron Stormcrow, Aka Limchalk, Amber Clark, Angelus, Atomaurus, Bastion Beefcake, Blue the Enigma, Braden Morris, Broken Beast 320, Captain Scurvy, Caspian, Shelly J, Corey Kenshin, Cronut 509, CrusaderChocobo, Cryptic Nightmares, CursepoxPrimarch, Dakota Lane Whetstone, Daniel Polson, Darth Miver, Deleted Account, Dirt Diver 030, M, Esteban, Fester's Lampshade, Freddy Krueger, Gorag Trimagazine, Grand Moth the Milky, Hades' Nephew, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Harley, Himbojerry, Horseman Sect Time, INSANITYGamerX, J. Kearns, Jesus Cornejo, Jordan Humble, Justin LaFontaine, Kaylee Ambrose, Kiri the Sloth, Crazy Kid, Cryolinian, Lambda M98, Lisa Cottrell, Little Crow, Lord Life's Best, Lupita Galvin, Love You Eminem, Matt Bach, Melted Lake, Michael Allen Jr. Bashirs, Mike, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Nate Cull, Nico Kayo, Psychomel, Red Shadow Cat, Rob Like Sharp Things, SamaHigh, Sashi Suzaku, Seclude, Stricken, Tali Sue, Tater Chip, That Creepy Chick, The Ginger Bros, Turtle Man, Voice of Sand, William King, Xavier and Cheyenne, Yarghoul, and Zachary Graphius. If you would like to join this list of names that I horribly mispronounce, then please head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, or you can always check out the names in the description down below, and I appreciate it infinitely. So thank you all on Patreon, thank you all so much, and to everyone, sweet dreams.